Detroit has been through hell and back on more than one occasion. Often ranked as the most dangerous city in America, Detroit has its fair share of problems and a pretty bad reputation on the world stage. That being said, we all owe this uniquely beautiful city a debt of gratitude. Not for the incredible music produced there in the 60s or even all the cars it has made, but for what it did during the Second World War. Its contributions to the war effort led to the Allied victory. In this video, we're going to discuss how the people of Detroit used industrial infrastructure to transform the city from the Motor City to the arsenal of democracy. Detroit's auto industry began in 1899 when Henry Ford established the Detroit Automobile Company, which produced 2 cars in 3 years and ultimately crashed and burned. That same year, Ransom E. Olds opened the first auto manufacturing plant in the city, only to be followed by Ford, who established his second car company, the Henry Ford Co., 2 years later. After that, William Durant and Charles Stewart Mott created General Motors in 1908, and Walter Chrysler established the Chrysler Corporation in 1925. Automobiles became the primary industry in the city, and together, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler became known as the Big Three. Detroit isn't called the Motor City for no reason, after all. The Big Three attracted a lot of people to Detroit and its surrounding suburbs, and it didn't take long for the city to become synonymous with industry and opportunity. Though it may be hard to believe now, in the 1920s, Detroit was nicknamed the Paris of the West, and was considered one of the most desirable places to live in the country. Between 1900 and 1930, the city's population boomed, going from 285,000 to 1.5 million, making it the 4th largest city in the US at the time. That all came crashing down when the Depression hit in the 30s, however. Car sales all but stopped, leading to mass layoffs, and Detroit faced the first of several subsequent downfalls. At that time, no one could have predicted that the thing that would save Detroit from its first major financial crisis would be World War II. In December 1940, when the war was already in full swing across the pond in Europe, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered one of his famous fireside chats to the nation. During his speech, he expressed his desire for the United States to begin supplying the Allies with as many planes, tanks, and weapons that it could. He already asked Congress on a number of occasions if they could commission the military production. Each time, Congress either said no or came back with a counter-offer that wasn't nearly good enough for FDR. So he turned to the automakers. FDR went to Bill Knudsen, the president of General Motors, and asked him to head up the US military production. Knudsen accepted the job, which paid him a salary of just $1, and lit a fire under everyone's ass when he said this to a group of the biggest automotive executives in the country. The first half of 1941 is crucial. Gentlemen, we must outbuild Hitler. General Motors immediately got to work on converting the auto factories into war factories, but it wasn't as easy as it sounded. The US was somewhat behind Europe in terms of military equipment. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the US Army had just 32 tanks, and they were still putting in orders for cavalry saddles. There was little industrial military standard at the time, and that made it difficult for GM to know what FDR really wanted. There was also somewhat of a political hurdle to overcome, as the army and airplane manufacturers didn't want the automakers to produce airplanes because of competition. It wasn't until the Battle of Britain, when the Royal Air Force lost more than 1,200 aircraft, that America comprehended the power of the Luftwaffe. Suddenly, business competition was no longer the most important thing to the American businessmen, and the War Productions Board worked to smooth over disputes about who could produce what. By 1942, GM was a major military contractor. It made everything: Navy fighter planes, artillery shells, trucks, cannons, torpedo bombers, tanks, and much more. The tanks, specifically, were produced in the Cadillac factory, which had once made some of the nation's most luxurious cars. But going from luxury cars to war tanks was no big deal for GM, which was directly responsible for $12 billion worth of war production by the time the Germans surrendered in 1945, making the company the largest military contractor in the world. GM produced almost 120 million artillery shells, 1.9 million machine and submachine guns, 854,000 trucks, 190,000 cannons, and a whole lot more. No other company or even country could match the amount of war material produced by General Motors. As for Bill Knudsen, GM didn't keep him as president of the company. Not long after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the US Army, where he served as a lieutenant general until the end of the war. Ford jumped into the military contracting game not long after GM in 1942. The company didn't waste any time eating Coney dogs and drinking Vernors. Its employees got straight to work on converting Ford's factories into war factories. Not only that, they also began building brand new factories to expand their production. The most famous factory they built was named Willow Run, which was the largest factory under a single roof in the world. In it, they built B-24 heavy bombers. Also known as Liberators, these planes were the largest the Americans produced during the war. While Ford Motor Company was no longer being run by Henry Ford directly, his son Edsel had his father's passion for innovation. He promised that his company would be able to produce the B-24s at a rate of 1 per hour, despite the insistence of aviation experts that it was impossible. Toward the end of the war, Ford achieved his goal, and the Willow Run plant was producing as many as 14 B-24s in a single day. In total, the company made over 8,600 of the planes by the war's end. To put that insane figure into perspective, it took 4 factories between 2 aviation companies to produce 9,800 Liberators. But Willow Run is not only famous for being a site of innovation, it has also gained fame because of one of its workers. Well, allegedly. Willow Run employed many so-called riveters or worker women. One of these riveters was a young woman by the name of Rose Will Monroe. She worked at the assembly line at Willow Run building bombers. One day at work, she caught the eye of some Hollywood producers visiting the plant and looking for young women to film for a war bond campaign. It's rumored that her part in the film inspired the famous "We Can Do It" poster. Since this is a history video, we have to mention that there is some debate about where Rosie the Riveter came from. It's not really clear. Despite this, Detroiters claim her as one of their own, including the writer of this video. If the evidence is good enough to be on Ford's official website, then it's good enough for Detroiters. The last company to join the party was Chrysler, who only rocked up after Bill Knudsen called the company's chief executive, K.T. Keller, to ask if he could build tanks. Keller replied, "I don't know, I've never seen one of these things." Keller soon began learning about tanks, and a short time later, Chrysler broke ground on the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. The plant had one goal: build as many tanks as possible using the tried and true methods of car manufacturing. It was something that had never been done before, but it worked. Chrysler began producing its M3 tanks before the plant was even finished. After the 1.25 million square foot factory was finished, production was upgraded and they began making M4 Sherman tanks. Instead of creating brand new engines for the 30-cylinder motors, they took 5 6-cylinder car engines and welded them together. These methods allowed them to produce a crap ton of tanks during the war. All told, the Detroit Arsenal built over 25,000 tanks, which was 5,000 more than the Germans. They even set an all-time production record by making 896 M4 tanks in 1 month in December 1942. But Chrysler's contributions didn't stop at tank production. In 1943, a handful of Chrysler engineers were asked to work on a top-secret project called Project X-100. They were told virtually nothing about what it was they were hoping to build, but they knew it must have been extremely important because the FBI patrolled the factory to make sure no information got out. Only the top Chrysler executives knew the engineers were hoping to create the atomic bomb. It was at a laboratory on Detroit's famous Woodward Avenue that Chrysler engineers designed the bomb's gaseous diffusers used for uranium diffusion. They were so well designed that one of Chrysler's factories produced 3,500 of them alone, and they were even used in the bomb that detonated over Hiroshima. Detroit's contribution to Allied war production cannot be understated, nor should it be forgotten. Between 3 companies in a city that was home to just 2% of the country's population, they made billions of bullets, tens of millions of guns, and hundreds of thousands of tanks, planes, and whatever else the military wanted. The Motor City truly was the arsenal of democracy. But what do you think of Detroit's contributions? Do you know of any other cities that were major contributors? Do any of you have family that worked for the Big Three during the war? One of the most remarkable things about studying war history is learning about groups of people whose bravery was largely swept under the rug. And no group's contribution to the war effort was more underappreciated than the Arctic convoys who saved the USSR's ass in World War II. For 4 years, 78 convoys traveled through the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans to deliver supplies to the Soviets. Without these supplies, the USSR would almost certainly have fallen to Germany. In this video, we're going to look at why that is and how a bunch of frozen Allied soldiers saved a nation. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, invading the USSR with 4.3 million German and Axis soldiers and 4,000 tanks. This was the largest land army ever assembled in human history. The invasion all but forced the Soviets to ally with the Western Allies. Though Churchill wasn't a fan of Stalin and his Bolshevik politics, he was eager for another ally in the war. Nor was Stalin, backed into a corner by the Germans, in a position to turn down a friend. They signed the Anglo-Soviet agreement on the 12th of July, agreeing to combine their efforts to take down Hitler. Churchill immediately dispatched 40 Hawker Hurricanes and 500 pilots and mechanics to defend the Soviet port of Archangel. But this was just the start. All in all, Britain and the US sent 3,000 Hurricanes and 4,000 other aircraft in support of the Soviets, along with other supplies and military equipment, including tanks and even food, to the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. Getting these supplies to the USSR was the tricky part. The British sent its first convoy, the Dervish, from Scapa Flow on August 17, 1941. The convoy sailed for Iceland before swinging around and heading to the Soviet Union, where, surrounded by polar ice, it arrived in Archangel on August 31. The Germans weren't aware of the convoy until Churchill announced its success in the House of Commons days later. Hitler was furious that the British had gotten the better of him and ordered German naval units to Norway to deter future convoys. Despite this early success, the Soviets weren't getting what they needed to keep the Germans at bay. So in October 1941, they signed the Lend-Lease agreement with the Americans, securing additional war materials. These were greatly needed, as much of the equipment the Soviets brought to bear was near obsolete in comparison to German equipment. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa alone, the Soviets lost 15,000, amounting to half of their fleet of tanks, which were no match for the German Panzers. To ensure the Soviets were well supplied, the Allies formed 3 principal shipping routes to the USSR. First, there was the Persian Corridor, which ran from the Persian Gulf and across Persia to the Caspian Sea, where it connected with the Soviet rail network. Then there was the route that ran from the US and Canadian West Coast ports across the North Pacific to Vladivostok. The Soviet-Japanese neutrality agreement complicated this route, as it stated that Soviet ships could only transport non-military supplies. But they put the Lend-Lease supplies on Soviet cargo ships anyway and hoped for the best. Luckily for the Allies, the Japanese military honored the agreement and never attacked any Soviet freighters in the Pacific. And finally, there was the Arctic route, which ran from Icelandic and British ports and along the northern coasts of Nordic countries into Archangel and Murmansk. However, the route had a German presence as they tried to take down Allied transports, which made things a lot harder for the convoys. Between August 1941 and May 1945, a total of 78 convoys took the Arctic route. Of all the routes to the Soviet Union, this one was by far the most unforgiving. The constant threat of German attack aside, the crews of these ships also had to contend with harsh weather, including dense fog, drift ice, and strong currents. In the winter, they had to navigate in perpetual darkness, and in summer, they were susceptible to German attacks under the midnight sun. The seamen in these convoys had to wear special suits when working on deck to protect them from the extreme temperatures. In reality, the suits were impractical and hardly ever worn. If a ship got torpedoed, there wouldn't have been enough time to put one on. Without a suit, life expectancy in the frigid waters in the Arctic winter was less than 2 minutes, and it was only slightly better in the summertime. The convoys were largely put together in Hafaljará, Iceland and Loch Ewe in Scotland. Most Icelandic convoys had the designation PQ on their outbound voyages and QP on their return voyages, whereas British convoys had the designation JW on their outbound journeys and RA on the returns, though there were some PQ convoys sailing from Britain too. This made it easier for the US and Canadian navies to identify them when running support convoys. Starting in 1943, the Americans and Canadians deployed escort carriers to defend the convoys against German air attacks. This was essential as the Arctic convoys were carrying incredibly important supplies, including fighter planes, tanks, ammunition, fuel, raw materials, and food. During the 2-year siege of Leningrad, the convoys were one of the city's few and most critical lifelines. In total, around 1,400 trips were carried out by around 400 cargo ships, of which the Germans sunk 85. In addition, 16 Royal Navy ships, which included 8 corvettes, 6 destroyers and 2 cruisers, were put below the waves. One convoy, PQ-17, experienced the greatest loss of any convoy during the war, losing 24 of its 35 ships between Spitsbergen and Novaya Zemlya. The Germans lost far fewer vessels. We're talking about 1 battlecruiser, 1 battleship, 3 destroyers and 30 U-boats. Although the loss of the battlecruiser and battleship was pretty big for the Germans. The most significant naval battle involving the Arctic convoys was the Battle of Barents Sea, fought between the Kriegsmarine and Royal Navy. On December 31st, 1942, the Germans tried to intercept a 14-ship convoy sailing from Murmansk. The ships were carrying 33 bombers, 87 fighters, 202 tanks, 2,046 other vehicles, and 80 tons of supplies, including 25 tons of fuel. Escorting the convoy were 6 Royal Navy destroyers and a number of corvettes. Additionally, the Royal Navy had stationed 2 destroyers and 2 cruisers in the Barents Sea. On the German side, the Kriegsmarine force deployed 6 destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers. While both sides brought to bear the same number of ships, the German fleet boasted superior firepower as it was hell-bent on sinking the entire convoy. While the Royal Navy was outgunned, it was not outwitted. Commander of the British fleet, Robert Sherbrooke, knew their only real defense against the Germans was their torpedoes. Not wanting to play his best card first, he maneuvered his ship so it looked like it was preparing to launch a torpedo, and the Germans fell for the bluff, withdrawing one of their heavy cruisers before the battle even started. But that cruiser bluffed as well and swung around to the north side of the convoy, where it fired on minesweepers and destroyers, sinking one of each. Following this, chaos ensued for about 4 hours. Because the battle took place in the middle of the polar night, it was extremely difficult to tell the difference between friendly and hostile ships. And the smoke from damaged and sinking ships only added to the confusion as both sides continued to fire without always knowing whom they were firing on. As a result of all this confusion, the short battle ended when the Germans decided the risk of sinking their own ships and killing their own men was too high, and they retreated. In the end, each side managed to sink a destroyer. The Brits also damaged a German heavy cruiser and the Germans a British destroyer. The British lost a total of 250 men and the Germans 330. The surviving Germans retreated to a base in Norway, and the convoy made it to its destination without losing any cargo. Throughout the years the convoys went through the Arctic, they saw relatively few battles. And of the ones they did see, most were short-lived, like the Battle of Barents Sea we just talked about. Overall, the operation in the Arctic was a major success with relatively low losses over the 4 years it was active. This was largely due to the breaking of the Enigma code, which allowed British intelligence to relay German U-boat positions to the convoys. Even though the Arctic convoys are considered a minor part of World War II, the convoys sustained the Soviets in their fight against the Germans. They also proved to the Soviets that the Western Allies were committed to their alliance. But what do you think? How do you think you would have fared in those Arctic winters? How might things have gone for the convoys without the breaking of the Enigma code? What do you think the convoy's overall significance to the outcome of the war was?
Back in July 2020, we released a video on the Philippine resistance against Japan in the Second World War. That video was more of an overview. We didn't really go into the logistics of the Philippine resistance movement, which, with more than 7,000 islands composing the Philippine archipelago, was a bit of a nightmare. In this video, we're going to explore said logistics with the aid of a report prepared by the staff of American General Douglas MacArthur and released to the public after his death. Launching the invasion from Taiwan, the Japanese hit the beaches of the Philippines on the 9th of December 1941. Defending the archipelago was some 150,000 American and Filipino troops under the United States Army Forces in the Far East, or the USA FFE, the US Navy, and the Philippine Army. Douglas MacArthur was in charge of them all, and he ultimately failed to stave off the Japanese advance. After escaping to Australia, having been ordered to by President Roosevelt, MacArthur swore he would come back. In the general's words, "I came out of Bataan, and I shall return." And he did, eventually. But a whole lot happened in the Philippines in the meantime. The Japanese occupation was, as you might expect, brutal. After some 76,000 malnourished American and Filipino defenders surrendered in Bataan in April 1942, the Japanese subjected them to the infamous Bataan Death March, in which as many as 10,000 of them died. From 1941 to 1945, the Japanese raided and looted, raped local women and took them as sex slaves, conducted sadistic medical experiments on prisoners, and straight up butchered people in atrocities such as the Manila Massacre, in which some 100,000 civilians' lives were taken from them. With the American and Filipino forces dead, imprisoned, or scattered, the people took matters into their own hands, rising up against the Japanese in loose vigilante groups. As stated in MacArthur's report, the small vigilante groups that were formed soon banded together for greater strength and mutual protection, and they later combined forces with the unsurrendered soldiers of the United States and Philippine forces and provided the nucleus for the guerrilla resistance movement. Coordinating their efforts wasn't easy though. As per MacArthur's report, the island's topography was a tremendous handicap to any effective unification of strength. Isolated from each other and from the outside world, the guerrillas at first dissipated their efforts in uncoordinated raids against the enemy. These minor operations were generally fruitless and often did more harm than good, since they brought swift and severe retaliatory measures by the Japanese. Still, the Allies came to comprehend the fighting spirit of the Filipino guerrillas and would not let it go to waste. MacArthur's report divided the progression of the resistance movement into 3 distinct phases, punctuated by the general's return in 1944. In Phase 1, the joint American, Australian, British, and Dutch Allied Intelligence Bureau, or AIB, sat back, took a deep breath, and tried to figure out exactly what it had to work with and how to go about it. As we said, there are over 7,000 Philippine islands. The guerrillas were isolated physically and also in terms of radio communication. Just one radio station remained in operation after May 1942. This was located in Luzon and manned by the Philippine Army officer Guillermo Nakar. In August, the Japanese found Nakar and killed him, severing all communication with the outside world. If it wasn't for American officers, Captains William Osborne and Damon Gowes, who escaped over the sea to Australia, MacArthur would have been left totally in the dark. Learning that the Filipinos were standing up to their oppressors, the AIB set about installing an intelligence network so it could better understand the situation and coordinate future activities. According to MacArthur's report, solutions were worked out for the best methods of dispatching supplies and funds to the Philippines. Areas of responsibility were defined, and plans were made for communication channels to forward information to Australia. Then, the field operatives went in. On the 27th of December, Filipino Captain Jesus Villamor, along with 5 men, departed Australia on the submarine Gudgeon. A month later, they made radio contact from the Philippines. At around the same time, 2 men under the command of the unsurrendered American colonel, Wendell Fertig, reached Australia and further enlightened the Allies of the situation in the Philippines. Fertig, who had become a guerrilla leader on the island of Mindanao, recommended that the Allies make a guerrilla base there, so they sent in American commander Charles Parsons to check it out. After he'd met with Fertig, Parsons continued throughout the Philippines to gather intel. In June 1943, Philippine Army Major Emigdio Cruz arrived in Australia from the US and then went on a clandestine mission in the Philippines at the behest of the exiled President of the Philippines, Manuel Quezon. If the Japanese had caught Cruz, they would have tortured him to death. And still, he traveled throughout the Philippines in various guises, gaining vital intel and ultimately receiving a Medal of Honor for his bravery. Thanks to men such as these, the intelligence network had a strong foundation, and MacArthur and the AIB had taken some major steps in support of the Philippine resistance movement. Of note, they had established basic radio communications and were ready to further improve their systems. They had transported military supplies and personnel to the islands via the US Navy, and they had grouped the Philippines' various guerrilla organizations into 3 main categories. This was how said categories were defined in MacArthur's report. Those built around a nucleus of unsurrendered United States and Philippine Army troops, those of purely local origin under the leadership of prominent civic personages or former constabulary, and those, like the Hukbalahaps, which were an outgrowth of pre-war semi-political organizations. There are also a few roving bands of the outlaw variety, which were motivated more by the lucrative prospects of brigandage. Now, Phase 2 could begin. By mid-1943, 2 major guerrilla leaders with whom MacArthur and the AIB worked were the aforementioned Fertig, who operated out of Mindanao, and Macario Peralta, a Filipino lieutenant colonel who operated out of Panay. Phase 2 was all about supporting these men and earning the loyalty of and supporting many other guerrilla leaders so that they could consolidate resistance efforts in the southern islands and then in Luzon, where the Japanese were strongest. MacArthur wouldn't risk too direct of an approach, however. As per the report, MacArthur directed that his agents follow a policy of careful instruction without direct command interference, which might incur resentment. Guerrilla groups were cautioned to refrain from open warfare against Japanese troops. The collection, coordination, and transmission of useful intelligence were stressed as the most important contributions the guerrillas could make until the actual Allied invasion of the islands began. Before that time, all military operations were to be limited to strategic harassment, sabotage, and ambush. Throughout the latter half of 1943 and all of 1944, the resistance movement grew in all ways. The civil government and the locals coordinated with and made voluntary contributions to the guerrillas, who created their own currency and postal system. Agricultural production and distribution were ramped up, and the communications network swelled, with radio stations installed throughout most of the southern Philippines by the end of 1943. Cargo submarine landings increased throughout 1944 as well, with the US Navy unloading more and more military personnel and supplies. All of this was in preparation for MacArthur's liberation of the Philippines, which he launched in October 1944. In Phase 3, quote, "The guerrillas emerged from their hideouts to take their places in battle beside the advancing American divisions. Now, they could engage in open war." On the 20th, MacArthur marched onto a beach in Leyte, where the US 6th Army, aided by some 3,200 guerrillas under Filipino Colonel Ruperto Canglion, went toe-to-toe with the Japanese 14th Area Army, claiming victory in late December. According to the report, this was where the Filipino guerrilla and the American soldier first joined forces in battle. The report continued. Canglion's forces dynamited key bridges to block Japanese displacement toward the target area, harassed enemy patrols, and sabotaged supply and ammunition depots. The guerrillas also performed valuable service in maintaining public order and in keeping the roads and highways free of congestion. After the American beachheads were established, the Leyte guerrilla groups were attached directly to the 6th Army to assist in scouting, intelligence, and combat operations. By then, Fertig had some 38,000 guerrillas under his command on Mindanao. Working from the island's interior to its coast, these men undertook a number of offensives against the Japanese, capturing many of their bases, including the airfields at Dipolog, Labo, Lala, and Barob, before MacArthur's forces had a chance to. MacArthur's report also commented on the importance of Fertig's radio and intelligence network. It consisted of some 70 transmitter stations and an excellent and extensive Coast Watcher system that helped considerably in the planning of further operations against the Japanese. Something similar happened with Peralta's guerrillas on Panay. According to the report, when the US 40th Division went ashore on Panay in March 1945, Colonel Peralta's forces made a large contribution towards eliminating the Japanese. Even before the landings, his guerrillas had cleared the enemy from the outlying districts and had won possession of 9 airstrips in the northern and southern parts of the island. As for the northern island of Luzon, due to the high Japanese presence there, the guerrillas were still scattered by the time of the liberation. Most guerrilla leaders weren't even aware that MacArthur was coming back until about a month before he set foot on that beach. Resistance fighters under American Major Bernard Anderson occupied a swath of southern Luzon. When the US 6th Army landed on the island, some of Anderson's best men were attached to the 6th, composing what was known as the Anderson Battalion. According to the report, this unit performed efficiently and valiantly throughout central and eastern Luzon and built a battle record of 3,000 Japanese killed and 1,000 captured. Japanese Colonel Kobayashi later paid tribute to Anderson, stating, "We attempted to extirpate the guerrilla movement in Luzon. Unfortunately for us, however, Colonel Anderson was too good a leader and the American guerrillas continued to function." In central Luzon, guerrilla units fought under Major Robert Lapham. Among other things, Lapham and his men helped rescue some 500 Allied prisoners from the infamous Cabanatuan POW camp. As stated in the report, the guerrillas acted as the eyes of the raiding force to guide it through the brush, and as its ears to be on the alert for any surprise flanking movement by the enemy. As for northern Luzon, many guerrillas answered to American Major Russell Volkmann, who had built up a force of some 10,000 men by late 1944, as well as an effective intelligence network of his own, though he wasn't able to get through to MacArthur until September 1944. Still, his guerrillas fought valiantly. To quote the report, Colonel Volkmann's units fought effectively with the 1st Corps against General Yamashita's beleaguered forces in the high mountains around Kiangan and in the plains of the Cagayan Valley. Supported by planes of the 5th Air Force, these guerrillas were able to clear the enemy entirely from Ilocos Norte province. As many as 260,000 guerrillas from 277 different guerrilla units fought the Japanese during the war. Combined, they played a major role in the Allied liberation of their islands, an operation that came to a close in mid-August 1945. Famously, MacArthur said, "Give me 10,000 Filipinos, and I shall conquer the world."
War can bring out the worst in humanity, but also the best. When their survival is at stake, humans can band together to achieve incredible things. Regular people can become heroes. Such was the case with the Coastal Picket Force or the Corsair Fleet in the Second World War, a group of civilian sailors who rolled up their sleeves to protect the US coast. This is their story. As with most things military, the structure of the US Navy during the Second World War was a little confusing. There was the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard, and prior to 1941, the Coast Guard was under the jurisdiction of the US Treasury Department. In June 1939, before the war had started, the Coast Guard formed the Coast Guard Reserve under an act of the same name. By early 1941, the Coast Guard Reserve boasted 7,000 to 8,000 civilian volunteers and 2,000 to 3,000 boats responsible for ensuring boating safety regulations were being followed and supporting the Coast Guard. In February, Congress split the Coast Guard Reserve into two sub-organizations: the US Coast Guard Auxiliary, composed of civilians, and the US Coast Guard Reserve, composed of reservists with military responsibilities. In this time of war, the jurisdiction of the Coast Guard Auxiliary and the Reserve fell to the US Department of the Navy. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Following that, German U-boats started stalking American ships along the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. For them, it was American hunting season. In March 1942 alone, they sank 70 American merchant ships in that strip of coast, and from mid-January to late June 1942, a total of 26 American ships had gone down, totaling over 1.25 million gross registered tons. As it stood early in 1942, the Coast Guard was unable to answer the U-boat threat, so one civilian stepped up. Alfred Stanford, the Commodore of the Cruising Club of America, had been trying to convince Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, to let private boats and their owners assist in naval matters off the East Coast since mid-1941. But it wasn't until May 1942 that Admiral King agreed. During the interim, the public had caught wind of the idea and its popularity grew. American sailors, yachtsmen, and fishermen wanted to step up and do their part. Stanford himself had rallied 70 yachts and 100 smaller vessels to the cause. With the Admiral's thumbs up, the Coastal Picket Patrol was formed, administered by the Coast Guard Auxiliary originally. The Auxiliary, however, a civilian organization, proved unable to effectively manage the Coastal Picket Patrol, or as it came to be known, the Corsair Fleet. So Admiral King put it under the direct control of the Coast Guard proper. As such, the Corsair Fleet was given battleship grey paint jobs and USCG number designations. Some vessels were also equipped with radios, sonar equipment, 50 caliber machine guns, 20mm guns, and 300-pound depth charges with which they could use to sink German subs. For a fun fact, among the volunteers was the novelist Ernest Hemingway, author of The Old Man and the Sea, among many other classics. He served aboard his 38-foot fishing boat, Pilar, patrolling the Florida Straits with a Tommy gun and some grenades on hand. Hemingway was a recognizable face the American people could get behind. The Coast Guard organized the Corsair Fleet into 6 groups: Northern, Narragansett, New York, Delaware, Chesapeake, and Southern. The fleet's task was to patrol the coast for enemy submarines and assist in rescue operations. If they had their guns, they were permitted to engage the enemy too. Often, the vessel's owners remained on their boats, which they crewed with, according to the Beach Patrol and Corsair Fleet by Dennis L. Noble, college boys, adventurous lads of shore villages, boy scouts, beachcombers, ex-bootleggers, and rum runners. According to a 1941 article in Popular Science, these men would be greenhorns aboard a battle wagon, but along the line of their own hobby, many of them are extremely good, and so are their boats. In terms of actual combat, however, the Corsair Fleet wasn't going in guns blazing, ripping submarine hulls open to the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, they had only one possible submarine kill when CJR 4436 dropped a depth charge on a position smoke bombed by a Civil Air Patrol flight. A column of oil was the only evidence that suggested they had hit the sub. On another occasion, on the 15th of September 1942, the sailboat Edlu 2 spotted a U-boat less than 100 yards ahead and, armed with only machine guns, charged the enemy vessel. Uncertain what sort of threat Edlu 2 posed, the Germans dived and fled. Lacking engines, the sailing vessels of the Corsair Fleet were sometimes able to go undetected by German sonar, allowing them to get closer to the U-boats and get a more accurate read on their position. According to Coast Guard historian C.K. Larson, the large 50 to 100 foot sailboats were the signature vessels of the CPF. They became important assets for the anti-submarine patrol as they could hear submarines more easily than motorboats and the Germans could not hear them. Just having the Corsair Fleet in the water was a deterrent for the Germans, whose presence off the east coast declined throughout 1942, many redirected to the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic. According to Larson, by mid-September of 1942, 480 CPF vessels were working along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts out of more than 30 bases. By December, nationwide, there were 2,093 responsible for recording sightings, unidentified sounds, and significant flotsam and jetsam. Perhaps more important than spotting enemy activity, the Corsair Fleet conducted rescue operations and retrieved lost cargo too. According to an official Coast Guard document, time after time, these Coast Guard auxiliaries took their vulnerable small craft, a few armed with only a rifle or a shotgun, others with boat hooks and flashlights, to haul drowning, burned, oil-covered merchant seamen from the peril of the sea. And in the words of author Joseph P. Freitas, more than 500 merchant seamen were rescued during the early phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. On the morning of the 13th of August 1942, for instance, U-171 surfaced on the Gulf and blew the steam tanker R.M. Parker Jr. open with a pair of torpedoes. The fishing yawl, designated CGRT-2267 or the Pioneer, got onto the scene right away, rescuing every single one of the tanker's crewmen. In January 1943, Admiral King cut the Corsair Fleet down by 35% due to the rapid decline of the German U-boat threat. By October, the fleet was disbanded. We'll end another quote from Freitas. To many military personnel, sailboats against the technologically advanced German submarines seemed ridiculous. But history shows how successful it actually was. We'd love to know what you think though. Had you heard of the Corsair Fleet before today? Do you know anything about the fleet that we didn't cover in this video? What about some more specific stories about what these brave civilians got up to during the war? After Hitler took the coward's way out on April 30th, 1945, the Second World War continued for over 3 months. German resistance collapsed fairly quickly, but in the east, Imperial Japan was digging in for the long haul. This is the story of the planned defense of the Japanese home islands, which would have been the largest and most costly operation of the entire war. The Allies had spent 5.5 years gradually pushing the Japanese back toward the home islands. Every campaign, every island hop, and every step had cost them tremendous amounts of sweat and blood. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated that the Japanese were still utterly committed and would make the Allies pay for every meter of ground with a liter of blood. No one, save for a few scientists and the president, knew about America's atomic weapons. When they pictured the coming invasion, all they could see was an endless battle of attrition. Japan's mountainous geography meant that there were only 2 viable landing beaches in the entire country, one on the southern island of Kyushu and the other on the Kanto Plain next to Tokyo. The Japanese knew this just as well as the Allies, giving them a key strategic advantage. They may not have known when, but they certainly knew where the Allies were coming. The Allied invasion plan was codenamed Downfall and was split into 2 phases, Operation Olympic in Kyushu and Operation Coronet on the Kanto Plain. Since the Japanese were sure to throw everything they had into the defense of these 2 zones, the Allies were forced to resort to the crudest method of waging war: sheer numbers. As part of Operation Olympic, the Allies would have to assemble the largest armada the world had ever seen: 24 battleships, 42 aircraft carriers, and 400 destroyers would escort 14 infantry divisions to the beachhead. In the skies, this gargantuan force was supported by no less than 1,000 B-29s of the 20th Air Force. The invasion would have to be the largest military operation ever seen, and that was just phase 1. The Allies, and especially the Americans, had raised the stakes far higher than Japan could afford. Where any other country would have folded and acquiesced to surrender, Japan went all in. Their plan was simple as it was horrific: cause such devastation to both themselves and the invaders that the Allies would be forced to accept Japanese conditions of surrender. They hoped that when the bodies of 1 million servicemen came home to the United States, the war-weary populace would demand the president let the Japanese imperial family off the hook, even though US propagandists had branded them war criminals. What were the Japanese admirals and generals willing to sacrifice to see this goal achieved? Everything, starting with the entire civilian population. So-called volunteer fighting corps were established across the country by government officers. All males aged between 15 and 60, all females aged between 17 and 50 were conscripted into these militia units. 28 million civilians were considered combat capable, but only 2 million were properly organized. None had uniforms or equipment, and they were armed with whatever they could find. The lucky ones were given swords, bows, long knives, or Molotov cocktails. The unlucky ones were made to do with sticks and other bits of wood. Yokiko Kasai, a high school girl mobilized as part of this so-called volunteer force, was given a dressmaker's awl and told, "Even killing one American soldier will do. You must aim for the abdomen." Japanese High Command planned for these stick-wielding units of high school girls and frail old men to act as a second line of defense behind the soldiers and sailors. They were supposed to throw their lives away as part of a campaign for the glorious death of 100 million. Remember, this was all to prevent Hirohito and his mates from being tried for war crimes. And these civilians would have likely seen action, as the first line of defense was, essentially, a gigantic kamikaze mission. When it became clear Japan was losing the war, the Army and Navy began pulling their aircraft back to the home islands. Every single plane, including trainers and air transports, was lifted out for kamikaze attack. By the end of June 1945, 10,000 kamikaze planes were ready. They were loaded with the minimum amount of fuel required for the pilots to get them to the landing beaches. From there, the pilots were trained to recognize landing craft as their primary targets. By this point in the war, most of Japan's experienced pilots had been killed, so it was left to the young and inexperienced to lead the kamikaze attack. Generals, safe in their bunkers, planned to order teenage boys to sacrifice themselves in the hope that they might sink enough transports to make the Allies temporarily call off the attack. But it didn't stop there. Beneath the waves, legions of suicidal frogmen waited to strike. Called Fukuryo by the Japanese Navy, these frogmen were equipped with a diving suit and a small mine on the end of a bamboo pole. They would deploy from submerged bunkers and walk toward the landing craft underwater. They were fed through tubes that provided liquefied food and carried enough air for several hours of operation. When the craft passed overhead, they were thrust to their pole upwards, detonating the mine and putting the boat out of action. The explosion would also kill the diver. The Navy planned to deploy 6,000 Fukuryu, but by mid-August, only 1,000 diving suits were available. Alongside the Fukuryu, the Navy also deployed 120 Kaiten-manned torpedoes and 2,412 kamikaze motorboats. The crew of these boats were also ordered to target the landing craft rather than the destroyer escorts to cause maximum casualties. Crew for the manned torpedoes and kamikaze motorboats were supposed to be volunteers, but this was rarely the case. Like their brothers in the skies, most were volunteered by their commanders or shamed into volunteering by political officers. Behind the screen of kamikaze aircraft, Fukuryu divers and suicide boats, Japanese soldiers and sailors stood ready to defend the beaches. They were armed with a vast assortment of weapons, which included captured Lee Enfield rifles from the fall of Singapore and German Karabiner 98s taken from the Chinese. When no weapons were available, conscripts were issued with a National Simplified Rifle. This was nothing more than a block of wood with a notch carved into the top where a bolt action and smoothbore barrel were clumsily tied down. This weapon usually had no sights and was single shot. Its designs were produced by the Japanese War Office and distributed to small-scale workshops around the country, meaning no two National Simplified rifles were the same. Some were chambered with pistol cartridges while others used rifle ammunition. Some didn't even use bullets, relying on a matchlock or percussion cap mechanism and a black powder charge. These were the weapons Japanese soldiers and sailors would wield against American semi-automatic M1 Garands, M1 carbines, and Thompson SMGs. It was never formalized, but even Emperor Hirohito himself admitted that the battles on the landing beaches would define the entire Allied invasion. All of the Army and Navy's strength, as well as virtually all of its ammunition, was concentrated at Kyushu and Kanto Plain. There could be no second wave of kamikaze attacks, and with the civilians armed and ready behind the soldiers and sailors, there was no one to work in the factories to produce more weapons or ammunition. The battle on the beach would have been all or nothing. Casualty predictions varied considerably, with some studies expecting losses of up to 4 million Americans and upwards of 10 million Japanese civilian casualties. Thankfully, it was not meant to be. On August 15th, a week after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito stepped in. On the advice of the Prime Minister and going against the interests of the Army and Navy, Hirohito unconditionally surrendered Japan to the Allies. In his surrender speech, he described atomic weapons as most cruel and highlighted they could take the toll of many innocent lives. All this from a man who was prepared to send schoolgirls to the front lines armed with sewing needles, and who would sell the lives of 100 million people to save his own skin. That was the insane story of the planned defense of the Japanese home islands and the lengths Japan's leaders would go to save themselves from justice. By the start of the Second World War, the British Empire was the largest empire in the world and human history, covering 30% of the planet's land. With the combined efforts of its territories, the British Empire was absolutely instrumental to the Allied war effort, contributing some 15 million military personnel and vast quantities of material. Britain was the first nation to declare war on Germany 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland. Its leader, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, took a bold stance against an aggressive Hitler and refused to bend to the Nazis' demands. On the 13th of May 1940, Churchill said, "You ask, what is our policy? It is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny. You ask, what is our aim? Victory. Victory, however long and hard the road may be." As May trudged into June, however, for the men on the ground in France, that strength started to waver. The German Blitzkrieg had taken France by surprise, and soon the Allies were scrambling to flee and overrun France via Dunkirk and the English Channel. The situation across the Channel in Britain wasn't amazing either, with the nation anticipating a shortage of supplies and even a German invasion. Then, the bombs started falling out of the sky. But just how close was Britain to keeling over in the Second World War? Was it ever holding on by a thread? In this video, we address these very questions. Of its 1939 population of 47,760,000, some 390,000 British military personnel served in 13 divisions under the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, in the Battle of France. Between September and May 1939, over 66,000 of these people became casualties of war, with 11,000 losing their lives, 14,000 sustaining wounds, and over 41,000 taken as POWs or labelled MIA. By the 21st of May, the Germans had pressed a huge chunk of the defending Allied forces toward the coast in northwest France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and encircled them. Between the infamous Dunkirk evacuation and subsequent evacuations from France, some 558,000 people were able to escape over the English Channel, including over 338,000 British troops. This was the vast majority of the BEF, but manpower isn't everything. In their escape, the BEF left behind tons and tons of precious material, including 435 tanks, 45,000 cars and lorries, 20,000 motorbikes, 2,500 artillery pieces, some 11,000 machine guns, 6,400 anti-tank rifles, some 77,000 tons of ammo, 415,000 tons of equipment and supplies, and 165,000 tons of fuel. If Hitler hadn't halted his advance on Dunkirk for 3 days, it's likely he would have struck Britain with a crippling blow, eradicating the BEF, which Churchill referred to as the whole root and core and brain of the British Army, and absolutely pulverizing British morale. Of course, history took a different turn, so Britain was nowhere near keeling over after the fall of France, despite losing its foothold on Europe. Back in the Isles, the British could see the war coming long before Hitler invaded Poland. The government understood that war of any caliber, let alone a world war, was an expensive endeavor. They also understood that Britain relied heavily on imports and sourced around 70% of its food from overseas. Right from the start of the war, the Germans attacked British merchant shipping with warships and U-boats in what became the Battle of the Atlantic, putting an even greater strain on British supplies. One drastic measure the British took was, make sure you're seated for this, the 1939 Pet Massacre. That's right, Anticipating a food shortage, people all across the UK started killing their cats and dogs so they would have fewer mouths to feed. People couldn't justify the, quote, luxury of a pet when their own lives and their country were at stake. Some pets were taken to professionals for destruction, while other owners completed the horrible job themselves. All in all, some 750,000 pets were killed in the British Pet Massacre. Though perhaps this was not an act of desperation so much as mass hysteria. The government implemented less dramatic measures to ensure that people didn't starve to death. One of such measures was rationing. The Ministry of Food implemented a system of rationing for many items, including but not limited to meats, eggs, milk, cheese, biscuits, and, God save us, tea. Later in the war, Britain established the Combined Food Board with the United States to help coordinate the supply of food to the Allies and import-starved Britain. Domestic food production also went up, with the British people creating so-called victory gardens on their home turf, just like they did in the US and other belligerent nations. Sports fields and golf courses became farms and vegetable patches. Even sections of Hyde Park in London were converted into arable plots. In a 1939 study conducted by Cambridge University physiologists Elsie Widdowson and Robert McCants, it was suggested that, even if the Germans destroyed 100% of British imports, the UK could persist on domestic food production without suffering from malnutrition. One of the main side effects of such a diet, which included a lot of bread and potatoes, would be a significant increase in flatulence and the size of people's poop. Lovely. With these measures in mind, it's safe to say that Britain wasn't hanging on by a thread in terms of food. The U-boat threat in the Atlantic wasn't eternal either. The Germans enjoyed two so-called happy times, tearing up British shipping after the nullification of the French Navy following the fall of France, and tearing up shipping bound for Britain after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. To put it in perspective, during the first happy time, from June 1940 and October 1940, 282 Allied merchant ships went down off the British coast, amounting to almost 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping. But by late 1943, the Allies had gained the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic by means of better tactics, such as increasing the size of escort groups, better air cover, better intel, notably through the cracking of enemy naval codes, better submarine detecting technologies like radar and sonar, better depth charges and other anti-submarine weapons, and a range of other factors. Later, Churchill wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." But with the US Navy standing in at Britain's side, the Germans were soon playing a losing game. While U-boats were attacking British shipping, the Luftwaffe hit Britain from the sky. While some 23,000 British civilians were killed in the Battle of Britain, and while a further 43,000 lost their lives in the Blitz, these German offensives didn't impact Britain's capacity to wage war as much as you might think. Flying against the Royal Air Force, which boasted skilled pilots and high morale, the Germans ultimately lost too many aircraft and experienced pilots to sustain their campaign. The Luftwaffe was supposed to soften Britain up for a German invasion, but the RAF and its allies fought valiantly in the defense of British military targets, vital infrastructure, and civilian lives. Britain's industrial output index dipped slightly in November and December of 1940, but actually increased most months after that. The Blitz, an attack on London designed to goad the RAF into a losing battle and destruction, was also a strategic failure. In the words of author Alfred Prince, "The truth of the matter, neither by attacking the airfields nor by attacking London was the Luftwaffe likely to destroy RAF fighter command. For the first time during the Second World War, the German war machine had set itself a major task which it patently failed to achieve." If Hitler hadn't directed the Luftwaffe against civilians, maintaining his focus on military targets and infrastructure instead, things may have been different. If the Luftwaffe had managed to destroy the RAF and soften Britain for an invasion, it still wouldn't have been the end of all things Britain. Churchill seemed to have meant it when he said, "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Too young or too old to fight in the regular British army, as many as 1.5 million Brits volunteered for the Home Guard between May 1940 and December 1944, the period for which the citizen militia was active. Among other roles, their main jobs would be to stall the advance of a German invasion and, after the regular forces had regrouped, maintain control of the civilian population. Within the Home Guard were secret units trained for guerrilla warfare. These were known as auxiliary units, and they may have proved instrumental in the event of an invasion, as evinced by other guerrilla operations during the war, such as those in the Philippines and in Greece. In England, some 3,500 auxiliary unit personnel trained at Coles Hill House, learning how to use tools like silenced pistols, American Thompson SMGs, Fairbairn Sykes fighting knives, and various explosives. Without some critical mistakes by the enemy and without its allies, notably the United States with its Lend-Lease policy, Britain may indeed have fallen in the Second World War. But Hitler did make mistakes, and Britain did have allies, and Churchill could always call upon the British Empire if it came down to a German invasion. While Britain lost its foothold in Europe early in the war, it remained a major player by fighting in the sea, the sky, and on overseas lands, notably in and in the vicinity of its imperial territory. World War II ushered in a slew of modern infantry weapons, many of them trumping the firearms of previous wars in both power and ease of use. So which new firearm was the best? In this video, we cover what we believe were the 3 best infantry weapons of the Second World War. Nicknamed Papasha, or Daddy, the PPS H-41 submachine gun was a very popular firearm used by the Soviets in World War II. Inspiration for the PPS H-41 came from the Winter War of 1940 when Russia invaded Finland. The Finnish fought using a similar submachine gun, the Suomi KP-31. It was so effective that the Russians copied it and began mass producing it within a year. In the spring of 1942, Moscow factories were churning out over 3,000 PPS H-41s every day. They were able to produce so many because the weapon was easy to manufacture and didn't require any skilled labor, so they could spare their skilled laborers for more advanced projects and recruit any average Joe to make daddies. Additionally, it could be made using cheap and widely available materials such as sheet metal and wood. The daddy was also popular because it was easy to use. Its mechanisms were simple and very little training was required to operate the weapon correctly. Its simple design also meant that it didn't easily jam and could be used for years without needing to be taken apart and cleaned. Simply designed, cheaply made, and easy to use, Daddy was the perfect weapon for soldiers fighting in a long war. The hallmark of this gun was its ability to fire 900 rounds per minute, one of the highest rates of fire in the war. Unfortunately, its magazine could only hold 35 rounds. Even with that bottleneck though, it was still one of the best infantry weapons of the war due to its durability and relatively low maintenance. By the end of the war, over 6 million PPS H-41s had been made, making it the most produced SMG of the whole conflict. Sometimes, entire Soviet infantry companies were equipped with the Daddy. The Soviets loved the Daddy so much they went on to supply the SMG to North Korea and China during the Korean War. The Luger is one of the most iconic weapons of the Second World War. Invented in 1899, however, it saw regular use decades before the war even started. It was first adopted by the Swiss Army in 1900 and then the German Army 8 years later. The Luger was used by several of the fighting nations in World War I, with more than 1 million being used in combat. The official description of the gun is a toggle-locked, recoil-operated semi-automatic pistol, which may not mean much to some. In short, it meant the Luger had a short recoil which made it easier to use, which in turn meant it was a reliable, durable, and accurate firearm. It was also so beloved that it became the standard service pistol for a number of nations, including Brazil, the Netherlands, Bolivia, Portugal, and Bulgaria. After widespread use in the First World War, more citizens from countries that used the Luger during the war, including the United States, wanted to get their hands on one. During the interwar period, the manufacturer of the Luger, DWM, exported the pistol all over the world. By the Second World War, the Luger was globally renowned, but it became most associated with the German army at the beginning of the war as DWM stopped exporting once the war broke out. The P08 became a prize coveted by Allied soldiers. P08s were largely viewed as trophies during the war. However, the game of capturing Lugers was a dangerous one. The German army caught on to this and began using Lugers as bait. They would leave them on the ground, seemingly discarded, to lure unsuspecting allies to their deaths. When they approached the bait, they would set off booby traps or detonate landmines. Rumors circulated amongst allies that American soldiers who were unfamiliar with the pistol's safety mechanisms accidentally discharged them frequently. Another popular but more terrifying rumor was that Germans who found Americans in possession of Lugers would be captured and then executed. We don't know how rooted in truth these rumors were, but it just goes to show that the Luger was a big deal in the Second World War. The M1 Garand was a semi-automatic rifle adopted by the US military in 1936. During World War II, nearly 5.5 million Garands were made, and they were so popular that they were used by every single branch of the US military. The Axis forces used bolt-action rifles, Germany with the Carabiner 98K and Japan with the Aerosan. The Garand was superior to these rifles because it had a high rate of fire at 40 to 50 rounds per minute and a maximum effective range of over 500 yards or 460 meters. It also featured an en-bloc loading mechanism, which meant that the clip, along with the cartridges, could be inserted into the rifles as one. Additionally, the Garand was designed to cycle rounds using its own gases. So while the enemy's bolt-action rifles had a limited rate of fire and magazines which only fit 5 or 6 rounds, the Americans had a magazine of 8 rounds with a much higher rate of fire. General George S. Patton said the Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised. The M1 Garand had a massive impact on the war. As the Garands were so much more powerful and had a superior rate of fire than other rifles, the Axis took notes and began to ramp up their production of fully and semi-automatic firearms to try and compete. But they were never able to reach the new standard the Garand created. A common story among Americans during the war was that enemy soldiers were rushing them when they heard the distinct pinging sound the Garand would make when it ran out of ammunition and the clip was expelled. The story became so common that a study was conducted during the war to prove the story false. The conclusion was that the rifle's pinging sound was too quiet to be heard over the roar of battle unless the listener was standing right next to someone with the Garand. And if an enemy soldier is already that close, you've got other problems. Luckily, were that story true, the Garand could be fitted with a 10-inch bayonet. But, all things considered, there was really no World War II rifle that could match the M1 Garand.
World War II brought about some amazing advancements in military technology, but for every effective new weapon, there were bound to be a few duds. Here are 6 of the weirdest and worst weapons of World War II. The Americans were known for their naval might with their reliance on massive aircraft carriers, powerful battleships, and speedy cruisers. One naval weapon that was anything but mighty, however, was the Mark 14 torpedo. The Mark 14 was developed in the 1930s to replace the World War I era Mark 10 torpedo. At a cost of nearly 10 grand apiece, the Mark 14 was never live fire tested as the Navy couldn't afford to do so, and it cost them dearly. The Mark 14 was overcome with issues the moment it hit the water. First, a lack of depth control meant that the Mark 14s routinely ran about 3 meters deeper than intended, often missing their targets completely. Additionally, Mark 14s were equipped with magnetic influence exploders to detect their target, but the inaccuracy of these devices caused an estimated 10% to detonate prematurely. And many torpedoes that did make contact with their targets never exploded at all because of fragile firing pins, which often bent due to the speed of the torpedo. The Mark 14's worst issue though was its tendency to circle back due to problems with its gyro angle. This meant American submarines sometimes had to dodge their own torpedoes. While it's never been confirmed, the Mark 14 was likely what sank the USS Gurion and USS Tullaby. It was only after these incidents that the Navy finally re-evaluated and fixed the Mark 14, which went on to be a much more reliable weapon after the war. Before the Allied landings at Normandy, the British were searching for ways to get through the Atlantic Wall, the coastal defences and barriers erected by the Axis. The Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapon Development was tasked with developing a weapon that could be launched from Allied landing crafts and would easily penetrate the wall. Their solution? The Great Panjandrum. Resembling a large spool, the Great Panjandrum was a steel-filled drum with explosives suspended between two wooden wheels. Cordite rockets attached to each wheel would propel the device forward, allowing it to reach speeds of around 100 kilometers per hour and creating enough momentum to blow a hole in the wall. While the design may have sounded good in theory, the testing of the weapon proved disastrous at every turn. The first iteration veered off course after several rockets failed. Testing the second iteration, many of the rockets detached, sending spectators flying for cover. The third iteration employed cables as a steering mechanism, but the cables quickly snapped, causing an additional hazard. Despite these issues, the researchers persevered. At the final demonstration, however, the Panjandrum swerved wildly off course, straight toward a line of high-ranking generals watching from a distance. After it almost plowed through the generals, the project was scrapped and the Great Panjandrum never saw battle. Germany was infamous for producing strange and experimental weapons during the war. None exemplified this more than the Krummlauf. German for curved barrel, this aptly named barrel attachment was designed to guide bullets around corners with the aid of a periscope. Development began in 1943 and 4 varieties were ultimately made, a 30-degree version for infantry and a 90-degree one for tank-mounted use, though only the 30-degree version was ever mass-produced. Krummlauf barrel attachments were designed to fit the Sturmgewehr rifle, an otherwise standard assault rifle. Unfortunately, the attachment made the rifles too impractical for the battlefield. A neat idea in theory, but physics ensured that the life of this barrel was short. Because of the pressure applied to the curved barrel each time a round was fired through it, the barrels could only endure 160 to 300 rounds. Additionally, the curve would cause bullets to shatter inside the barrel, spitting the fragments out like shotgun pellets. The designers tried to fix this by adding venting holes to the barrel, with little success. This meant that, as a rifle, it proved very ineffective as it couldn't be fired from any meaningful distance. Even so, the idea of a curved barrel fascinated other military powers, and both the Soviets and the Americans tried to replicate it with similar results. Another brainchild of German engineers was the V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile. Otherwise known as the Vengeance Weapon 2, it was designed by a team led by Wernher von Braun, a German scientist who would go on to be a rocket pioneer at NASA. The V2 was incredible in all technical aspects. 14 meters long and weighing between 12,700 and 13,200 kilograms, the V2 became the first rocket to reach space in June 1944 when it rose to an altitude of 175 kilometers. Traveling at supersonic speed without an audible warning, these rockets seemed promising to the Germans, who were increasingly desperate for a wonder weapon as the war dragged on. In September 1944, over 3,000 V2s were launched against Allied troops in Britain, Belgium, and France. Overall, the attacks killed around 9,000 civilians and military personnel at an average of less than 3 deaths per rocket launched. This was by no means effective, as the cost to create a V2 rocket was astronomical, especially for an already struggling economy. Though the exact cost is unknown, some sources claim it was around $500 million in 1940. As historian Steven Zaloga notes, the entire 7-month V2 missile campaign delivered less high explosive on all the targeted cities than a single large RAF raid on Germany. While the V2 was an impressive technological feat that would go on to revolutionize rocketry and space travel, pouring the time and money into building it proved a bad military decision for the Germans. While the Germans were developing ballistic missiles, the Japanese were toying around with another long-range weapon, the Fu-Go balloon. The Fu-Go was conceived in the late 1930s but not introduced until 1942 as a retaliatory measure after the American raid on Tokyo. The Fu-Go was a low-tech solution to long-range weaponry. After months of design, the Imperial Japanese Army's No. 9 Research Laboratory prototyped a balloon 6 meters in length that could fly at 7,600 meters for about 30 hours. Constructed with 5 layers of washi paper glued together with potato paste, these balloons were strapped with 5 kilogram timed incendiary devices that would detonate at the end of their flight. The balloons were specially designed to be launched from Japan and reach the continental US using the jet stream currents. Over the course of several months, the Japanese launched 9,300 Fugo balloons toward the US, with only 300 reaching land. However, issues with detonators meant that many of these never exploded, and those that did caused no real damage or loss of life. The only exception was on the 5th of May 1945, when one balloon killed 6 civilians, a woman and 5 children, after they found it in a national forest and disturbed it, causing it to detonate. These were the only fatalities in the continental US during the entire war. In 1945, the Japanese abandoned the project, accepting it as a massive failure. Perhaps the most controversial of all the worst weapons were the Soviets' anti-tank dogs. The program began in the 1930s, with the Red Army devising ways for canines to deliver live explosives to enemy tanks. But when the dogs failed to leave the bombs correctly, the Soviets conceived a simpler, crueler tactic: strap bombs to the dogs to detonate on impact with the tanks. The Soviets trained German shepherds by placing food under tanks. The dogs were strapped with 10 to 12 kilograms of explosives that would detonate as they crawled under the tanks. In training, they were remarkably accurate, and toward the end of 1941, the first group of dogs was deployed to the front. Once on the battlefield, several issues emerged. First, while the dogs were trained using Soviet diesel tanks, Germans used gasoline tanks, and the difference in scent confused the dogs. Additionally, the stressful atmosphere of the battlefield caused many dogs to run away or run back toward their handlers. Of the first 30 dogs, only 4 managed to detonate near tanks. 6 turned back and exploded near their handlers, killing and injuring them. Others ran away or were shot before they could reach their targets. Plus, the Germans quickly realized the Soviets' plan and were instructed to shoot any dog on the battlefield as a precaution. Overall, the anti-tank dogs had some success on the battlefield, though the exact number of tanks they destroyed is unclear. The Soviets claimed upwards of 300, but many believe this number to be propaganda. After 1942, the program declined as dogs were deployed elsewhere for mine-sniffing tasks. But the Soviets didn't fully abandon the program until 1996. The Japanese and the US also experimented with anti-tank dogs, though both without much luck. While some of the weapons we discussed in this video eventually went on to be successful or lead to revolutionary technology, during the war they were costly, ineffective, and crude. But what do you think? Which one of these weapons was the absolute worst? The stories of World War II are characterized by human valor, horrific atrocity, and geopolitical shifts on an unprecedented scale. But there's something else too: technology. Tech has been part of warfare since ancient times, but the 20th century saw machinery of frightening sophistication enter the fray for the first time. In the First World War, pilots in Sopwith camels and Fokker Eindeckers jousted with one another above the trenches of France and Belgium, while the lumbering armored hulls of rudimentary tanks crawled across battlefields for the first time at the Somme in 1916. By the Second World War, however, the landscape was different. Very, very different. Flimsy, open structures had given way to robust, agile Spitfires, Mustangs, and Messerschmitts, along with the long-range bombers that would serve so devastatingly from Coventry to Dresden to Nagasaki. On the ground, the clanking and cumbersome proto-tanks had become swift, highly maneuverable war machines, and hardware like the German Panther and the Soviet T-34 has since transformed into the stuff of legend. Today we're going to be looking at one of the most famous, celebrated, mythologized tanks of the war, the German Tiger tank. Most agree she was the most powerful tank of the war, but was she the best? Like with many feats of engineering wizardry, both in peacetime and wartime, the Tiger's development was influenced by a problem-solution dynamic. A large, heavy tank had been in development since January 1937, and the early proto-Tigers resembled tougher, bulkier versions of the already popular Panzer light tank. An initial design, the Durchbruchwagen, or breakthrough vehicle, was abandoned in 1938,
and the German army turned its attention toward the even more robust VK30.01 and VK36.01 models. But it was the outbreak of the war the following year that brought the problem that would need to be resolved. Speed, agility, and withering brutality saw the Blitzkrieg sweep across Western Europe in the opening months of the war, and the light panzer tank was highly effective in this. This is not to say that the German advance did not falter here and there, and stiff resistance in the form of the French Samoa S-35 and Char B-1 and the British Matilda II tanks left the German command with a conundrum on their hands. A year later, the Blitzkrieg was rolling eastwards as Operation Barbarossa saw the greatest mobilization of troops in history. The full might of the Wehrmacht was unleashed upon the Soviet Union, but here too there was friction and failure. Even before the dogged defense of cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad began, the advancing Germans found themselves struggling against superior T-34 medium tanks and the monstrous KV-1 heavy tanks. Victories in the west and in the east gave Germany the advantage, but as General Guderian swept ever deeper into Russia, he may well have considered the words he'd uttered some 4 years earlier. If the tanks succeed, Guderian had said, then victory follows. There was no guarantee that Germany's tanks would succeed. If the ultimate aims of the Blitzkrieg were to be realized, the German Heer armed forces would need a new weapon. A far better weapon than anything the British or Soviets could throw at them. By 1942, the Tiger I was in service. While the vehicle had been rushed through the final design and development phases, it was still a seriously impressive beast. Almost 6.5 meters from front to back and weighing in at 57 tons when fully laden for combat, the Tiger would have been quite a sight to behold. With the gun included, the vehicle was closer to 8.5 meters in length, more than 3.5 meters wide and 3 meters tall. It was also encased in armor with 100mm thick plates protecting the frontal hull and turret of the Tiger, and plates ranging from 120mm to 200mm in thickness elsewhere, welded together to create a formidable set of defenses. The main gun of the Tiger was the 56 caliber 8.8cm KWK-36, a weapon that could be devastating at both long and short ranges. Designed to be accurate, punishing, and versatile, the KWK could fire the Panzergranate 39 capped armor-piercing round, the Panzergranate 40 composite rigid armor-piercing round, and the Granate 39 Hollodung high-explosive anti-tank round, although keeping the Tiger and her crew fully supplied would prove difficult later in the war. This beast was driven by a 21.35-litre 12-cylinder petrol engine developed by Maybach and capable of achieving a top speed of 38 km per hour. In later versions, the engine was upgraded, expanding the capacity and pushing the power output levels from 650 to 700 horsepower. On the surface, this was a masterpiece of engineering, but would this translate to success in the field? While Nazi engineers and strategists had been watching the progress of the Blitzkrieg carefully, they were not alone. The Americans had been watching too, and they'd been learning a lot. The United States knew that Guderian was right. A tank victory was crucial to overall success in the field. And so, the M4 Sherman was born and entered service in 1942, the same year as the Tiger. Variants of the Sherman ranged from 2.62 meters to 3 meters in width and between 5.84 and 6.27 meters in length. Substantially smaller than the Tiger, although her height was similar. Like the Tiger, the Sherman could carry 5 crew members who would be protected by armor plating across the hull, turret, and all other areas of the tank. This armor plating was not quite as robust as that of the Tiger. The front of the hull was encased in 50.8mm thick armor, around half the thickness of the Tiger's armor, although the angled design pushed the effective thickness beyond 90.8mm. The turret featured armor plates between 25.4mm and 76.2mm in thickness, far thinner than the Tiger's beefy protection, although the effectiveness of this was also boosted by the angled design. Various tweaks and upgrades were made to this armor across the tank's operational history, eliminating weak points and better protecting the crew members within. Primary firepower was provided by 75mm M3 guns, although 76mm variants and even 105mm howitzers featured on some models. These were backed up by Browning machine guns as a secondary armament. Not quite so heavily armed nor so heavily armored as Germany's behemoth, the Sherman had its work cut out for it against the Tiger. And yet, despite the apparent technological advantage, the Germans were pushed back across France following the Normandy landings, eventually retreating into the very heartlands of Germany itself. So just how did the Sherman emerge victorious in Western Europe? Germany's tank battalions earned themselves a legendary reputation, and deservedly so. Tank units were instrumental in smashing the resistance in Western Europe in the early years of the war, and then on the Eastern Front as the Wehrmacht savaged the Russian forces. The mythology surrounding the German hardware largely turned out to be true. The far lighter Sherman, for example, paled in comparison with the Tiger I, and the arrival of the Tiger II, or King Tiger, tipped the scales even further in Germany's favor. It was said that a Tiger II could withstand the onslaught of 10 or even more Shermans, and this rumor was frequently proven right on the battlefield. The long-range guns could pick off these allied war machines at a distance, while the formidable armor plating repelled most attacks. A well-crewed, fully armed Tiger laying waste to an armored column devastated enemy morale. These juggernauts scored significant victories even late in the war, at Gumbinnen on the Eastern Front and in the Ardennes in the West. So, what went wrong? If the Tigers were so formidable, why were the Germans pushed back in their final years of the war? If the Tiger was such a brilliant piece of design, why did it backfire so badly? There are a few things to consider here. The first being the semi-literal elephant in the room. The Tiger was enormous. While this made it difficult to beat in open combat, it also made the vehicle difficult to maneuver and vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. Without cover, a Tiger might be a match for a dozen Shermans, but Allied commanders quickly learned to use the agility and swiftness of their machines to their advantage. Next, we've got a word that so often gets used to describe the Tiger: over-engineered. The tank was a serious feat of design and development, and this showed on the battlefield. But while complex problems lead to complex solutions, the reverse is also true, especially once these solutions start breaking down. It was difficult for the Wehrmacht's tank crew to keep the Tiger in the field, and this rapidly became an issue. It wasn't just difficult to keep Tigers in the field, it was difficult to get them there in the first place. Building a Tiger required vast amounts of material and manpower. It also required infrastructure and resources. While the tank-producing factories in places like Kassel were working at full capacity under the shield of the Luftwaffe, and as the country expanded its territory into the resource-rich lands of Russia, this wasn't a problem. When Allied bombers began to pound German industry day and night, and the workforce was siphoned off by an ever-receding front line, it did become a problem. A big problem. Of course, industrial might wasn't a uniquely German phenomenon. Across the Atlantic, and safe from energy bombing raids, American factories went into overdrive. If a Tiger could knock out 12 Shermans, then there'd better be at least 13 Shermans for every Tiger. In the end, Germany churned out less than 2,000 Tiger tanks. The United States knocked out 50,000 Shermans. Finally, the technology itself. Yes, traditional shells would bounce off the armor plating of the Tiger, but this is just one half of that tried and tested problem-solution dynamic. The United States and the Soviets were able to develop anti-tank guns that could damage or even disable a Tiger, but only the United States was able to mount these guns on Shermans. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, and the war in Europe was over. The German military machine and its elite soldiers and much vaunted hardware were defeated. With Tiger tanks and Me-262 jet aircraft and majestic battleships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz, the Germans had led the world in terms of military technology, But these war machines would eventually come to naught. There were just too many other factors at play, and the Germans found that engineering prowess would not be enough to stem the tide of the Allied advance. As resources grew scarce, Leviathans like the Tiger became more a hindrance than help. For a little while though, the whole world cowered when the Tiger roared. The German Air Force, also known as the Luftwaffe, was easily the largest and strongest air force in Europe in 1939. Wielding planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe was a force to be reckoned with, but it wasn't invincible. At least 2 British fighter aircraft held their own against the Luftwaffe. These were the P-51 Mustang and the Supermarine Spitfire. When Luftwaffe pilots saw a fleet of these aircraft, they trembled with fear. But which of these 2 planes did the Luftwaffe fear more? It's not as simple as just comparing the Mustang and Spitfire's stats. There's a lot of other factors to consider, so let's get stuck into it, starting with the Spitfire. The iconic Supermarine Spitfire first appeared in 1935, but the aircraft wouldn't enter battle against the Luftwaffe until October 16, 1939. From its very first battle, the Spitfire was a success. The Spitfires were sent to intercept some of the Luftwaffe aircraft that were flying over the Firth of Forth in Scotland. It's said that, at the first sight of the Spitfires, the Germans turned in an attempt to escape. One of the German pilots who survived said it was not a pleasant experience. The British Royal Air Force, or RAF, produced over 20,000 Spitfires over the next 10 years. This was because the Spitfire wasn't overly expensive and could outperform almost any other World War II era fighter. It was a single-seater fighter equipped with a V12 Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which was later upgraded to a V12 Rolls-Royce Griffon. It had a wingspan of 36 feet and 10 inches, a length of 29 feet and 11 inches, and stood at 11 feet and 5 inches tall. Its relatively small size allowed for better maneuverability, which was essential in dogfights. Later, they could reach a ceiling of 40,000 feet or 12,200 meters, and when in the right conditions, they had an incredible top speed of 440 miles per hour or 710 kilometers. The Spitfire proved its dominance in the war. In fact, many believe it was the Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain. When Spitfires chased the Luftwaffe out of Britain, they instilled fear in the German pilots. In the words of German ace Hugo Broch, the Spitfire was greatly respected. However, the aircraft had one major flaw. Because it was designed smaller and designed as a rapid interceptor, it couldn't hold much fuel and couldn't travel as far as many other planes, including the Mustang. The Spitfire had a maximum flying range of about 600 to 650 miles. This didn't stop the Spitfire from dominating dogfights, however. According to Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, the best thing about the Spitfire was that there were so few of them. Galland realized the potential power of the Spitfires. During a meeting about how the Germans should succeed against the RAF, Galland replied to the Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring to, quote, give him a squadron of Spitfires as a solution. His request, of course, did not impress Göring. But what did the Luftwaffe think of the Mustang? The North American Aviation Unit created the P-51 Mustang for the RAF in 1940. At least 14,000 Mustangs were manufactured during the war, 8,000 of which were the P-51D model. The RAF equipped the P-51D Mustang with a V12 Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which was the same engine as the Spitfire. This plane managed incredible heights of up to 42,000 feet or 12,800 meters, and in the right conditions, the single-seater boasted speeds of up to 440 miles per hour. But the main purpose of the Mustang was to escort bombers. It could travel at an impressive distance of 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers with a single load of fuel, which was important because it meant the fighter could fly to Berlin and back without stopping. As RAF Captain Eric Brown said in his book Wings on My Sleeve, if I was in a dogfight over Berlin, I would want to be in a Spitfire. If I was in a dogfight over Berlin and wanted to fly back to Britain, I'd want to be in a Mustang. The Mustang had a wingspan of 37 feet. It was 32 feet and 3 inches long and stood 13 feet and 4.5 inches tall. Despite its larger size, The Mustang was maneuverable and performed well in dogfights. The Mustang earned a reputation among the Luftwaffe pilots as a far superior aircraft to its Luftwaffe counterparts. By the time the Mustang made its way into the war, the Luftwaffe pilots had more experience fighting against the Spitfire, but they weren't prepared for a newer and arguably stronger opponent. So when the Luftwaffe first encountered the P-51, they felt blindsided and were now fighting against aircraft that they hadn't seen before. When Luftwaffe pilots returned from battles against the Mustang, they told of the new superior aircraft to their own, and the word spread across the enemy line. As is best told by Erich Hartmann, known as the pilot with the most aero victories of all time, when describing how Luftwaffe pilots felt about the Mustangs, he said, "We both dreaded and anticipated meeting the American Mustangs. We knew that they were a much better aircraft than ours, newer and faster and with a great range." Even though Hartmann claims to have personally downed at least 7 P-51D Mustangs, he clearly had a deep respect for them. The Mustang was the newest and strongest fighter aircraft in the later part of the war, and even though the Mustang only went into battle in 1942, it is widely regarded as the best all-round fighter of World War II. The aircraft claims this title because of its impressive specifications. The US developed the Mustang almost 4 years after the British developed the Spitfire, and so, accordingly, the Mustang benefited from the newer technology. It goes without saying that the Spitfire and Mustang were great rivals to their enemy aircraft, and each had its own purpose in the war at different stages of the war. But which Allied plane did the Germans fear the most? Perhaps it's best concluded by the Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring, who had a lot of respect for the British fighter aircraft. In an interview discussing fighter aircraft, Göring mentioned that the Me-410 was superior to the Spitfire in an attack against it and not suitable for purely defensive purposes as the Spitfire, which, although a little slower, was much more maneuverable. So that's how Göring felt about his pilots battling against the Spitfire, but his attitude was completely different when speaking about the Mustang. In an interview, Göring said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Based on the quotes we featured in this video, we'd say that they feared the Mustang more than the Spitfire, but the true answer is of course up for debate. Which of the two aircraft do you think the Luftwaffe feared more, the Mustang or the Spitfire?
Wars bring out the worst in people, but sometimes also the best, at least in terms of creativity and inventiveness. World War II was an arms race, and its participants were constantly inventing new stuff to get a leg up on their enemies. Some of these inventions were great, some were strange but effective, and others were straight up weird. The Germans made 1,300-ton artillery pieces, the British invented aircraft carriers made of ice, and the Japanese deployed manned torpedoes. But what about the Yanks? Did they come up with any weird stuff during the war? Many would argue that America's advantage was its industrial capacity, so surely they came up with some mad stuff. Spoiler, they did. And in this video, we're going to take a look at 3 weird American inventions. You may think this first one must have been conceived by an absolute lunatic, but we beg to differ. Making a bat bomb is a perfectly reasonable and socially acceptable thing to do, and we're surprised someone didn't think of it sooner. About a month after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the White House received a letter from a Pennsylvanian dental surgeon by the name of Lytle Adams. The surgeon had been sussing out the bats in a cave in a national park a little while back when the world's greatest idea came to him. What if bats could be weaponized? What if the Allies could use them to burn down Tokyo? Because why not burn down Tokyo, right? Bats, in Adams' words, were the lowest form of animal life, and the reasons for their creation had remained unexplained until now. This was the reason God made bats, to frustrate any attempt of those who dared desecrate the American way of life. Finishing Adams' letter, Roosevelt said, "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into. Good on you, Frank." Basically, the plan was to get a bunch of hibernating Mexican free-tailed bats and glue time-released napalm incendiaries to their chests. The armed bats would then be shoved into a 1.5 meter or 5 foot metal tube. Each of these tubes could carry over 1,000 bats and would be dropped off from an aircraft at an altitude of 1,200 meters or 4,000 feet. Once deployed, the tube would open and the bats would burst into the sky. Ultimately, they would roost in Tokyo, a city composed mostly of wood. Once the incendiaries pinged, the bats would burst into flames and take Tokyo to hell with them. It was bloody foolproof. In May 1943, the bat bomb was undergoing tests in New Mexico when the bats got out and roosted on a fuel tank which exploded and turned the testing ground to ash. By December, the bat bomb project, deemed Project X-Ray, had passed into the hands of the Marine Corps. The Marines tested the bats on a mock-up Japanese village constructed in Utah earlier that year, and it was a great success. In the words of the chief of incendiary testing, a reasonable number of destructive fires can be started in spite of the extremely small size of the units. The main advantage of the units would seem to be their placement within the enemy structures without the knowledge of the householder or fire watchers, thus allowing the fire to establish itself before being discovered. Project X-Ray was looking good, but some idiot decided it would be better to conduct more tests before unleashing an army of bats on Uncle Sam's enemies, and the bat bomb was delayed and delayed until US Fleet Admiral Ernest King canned the project because it supposedly wouldn't be combat ready until halfway through 1945. The Yanks would spend their time and money on another catastrophic project instead, the atomic bomb. Some critics argue that the bat bomb would have done an equally good job of ending the war while also sparing thousands of Japanese lives. A fire, after all, is a little easier to outrun than an atomic blast. But that's not what happened. Adam's bats never fulfilled the purpose God had intended. Pigeons, on the other hand, were freaking prolific in World War II. They were legit war heroes, carrying life-saving messages time and time again and winning tons of medals. What you might not have known is that they could also be made to steer missiles. Probably. By 1943, the US was super keen on bombing Germany, but they couldn't figure out how to aim their missiles straight. That was when an American behaviorist by the name of B.F. Skinner entered the scene and said, "It looks as if the Japs are using men to guide their missiles. Perhaps we can get American morale that high, but if not, I can provide perfectly competent substitutes." And these substitutes were, of course, pigeons. According to a bloke named James Capshaw, author of this article, Skinner's plan was to construct a missile guidance system utilizing the conditioned pecking behavior of pigeons. What this meant was that Skinner would put a few pigeons in the guidance system of a glider bearing a warhead. The system would consist of 3 nose-mounted lenses that projected an image of a bombing target on screen. The pigeons, trained to recognize certain images, would then peck these targets when they appeared on the screen. For this, they would be rewarded with some seed, which would be dispensed by the system. If the missile went off, of course, the pigeons would see the image move and follow it while pecking the screen. This would move the screen, and as this happened, the guidance system would adjust the glider to recenter the target, or something like that. All you need to know is that the pigeons would pilot the damn glider. Skinner got a grant of $25,000 from the National Defense Research Committee to bring Project Pigeon to life. But it wasn't enough, and the men upstairs canned his project in October 1944 because, quote, "Further prosecution of this project would seriously delay others which have more immediate promise of combat application." In other words, they wouldn't have recognized a war-winning intervention if pigeons steered it into their living rooms and blew them and their entire family to pieces. And isn't that just the perfect segue into the next wacky invention we'll be covering today? Farts. In August 1943, an SOE bro named T.R. Bird sent a message to OSS bro named Stanley Lovell, explaining how the British were creating a weapon known as S-liquid. This was a foul-smelling substance that they intended to package in small gelatine bombs that could be planted in German pockets. Pre-broken, the bombs would produce a horrendous smell that would ruin the target's sexy Hugo Boss jacket and make him lose face among his equally well-dressed comrades because it smelled like poo. The bombs could be used to create confusion and for the purposes of terrain denial, in other words, to empty a room. The Brits had a spray version of S-liquid as well, and these weapons were designed mostly for use by Allied saboteurs and resistance groups, not soldiers. Once Lovell found out about the SOE's fart juice, he rallied the OSS to begin work on an American version. The project was codenamed Why Me, and for the next 2 years, the OSS toiled day and night to recreate, quote, "the revolting odor of a very loose bowel movement." What they came up with was a concoction of butyric acid, valeric acid, caproic acid, and scatolate in case you wanted to try it at home. Lavelle believed the Japanese would be especially vulnerable to America's fart juice, stating, "A Japanese man thought nothing of urinating in public, but he held defecation to be a very secret, shameful thing." One of the main issues the OSS faced was that, quote, "almost without exception, the operator was contaminated when squirting the contents of the tube." So yes, they could make the enemy smell like fart, but the fart minister would smell like fart too. Either way, the OSS never got to test the substance on the Japanese because America nuked Japan before they got the chance. Bat bombs, pigeon-guided missiles, and fart juice. The Yanks certainly came up with some game-changing stuff during the war, but they definitely weren't as on top of it as the Brits. Of the 3 inventions we covered in this video, which do you think was the most insane? After the fall of Poland and France in the opening stages of the Second World War, and before the official entrance of the United States and the Soviet Union, Britain stood alone in Europe. The colonies were far away and in many cases unsure of their own survival. British forces needed new weapons to battle the continental fascists, and British inventors and engineers were given a blank check to create them. But some of these inventions were, perhaps, a bit too innovative. In this video, we shed light on 5 of the downright nuttiest inventions the British threw together. Aside from the imminent threat of invasion, the main problem Britain faced was supply. The British Isles had long relied on raw materials, fuel, and food from the rest of the empire to keep things running. But in the first half of the Second World War, this supply line was nearly severed. German U-boats prowling the Atlantic sank hundreds of ships and destroyed millions of tons of vital supplies. The best way to defend against them was with aircraft, but in the years before cheap steel aircraft carriers were available, one man suggested building carriers from ice. British inventor Geoffrey Pike developed a special kind of ice named pykrete, which was made from water and frozen wood pulp. It was exceptionally strong and melted very slowly, plus it was a heck of a lot cheaper than steel. Pike's pykrete impressed the admirals and Winston Churchill, who greenlit the project. Testing began in 1942, and the project, now codenamed Habakkuk, looked promising. As did the prototype, but this was its downfall. As more top military officers heard about the aircraft carrier made of ice, more specifications rolled in. One Air Chief Marshal decided it had to be bomb-proof, while an admiral wanted it to mount a battery of anti-aircraft defenses. The project soon grew out of hand, and both the cost and effort of making the vessel outweighed its potential usefulness. When it became clear it wouldn't be ready by 1944, Pike's ice ship was scrapped. It wasn't just massive projects like Habakkuk that kept the Royal Navy busy during the war years. They had plenty of smaller ones on the go too. One of these was a rocket-propelled rolling death ball called the Great Panjandrum. In 1943, military planners foresaw that, at some point in the future, the Allies would launch an amphibious invasion of Europe. Hitler knew this too and built a formidable network of defenses across the Western European coast, dubbed the Atlantic Wall. Panjandrum was designed for one thing: blowing holes in the Atlantic Wall. The brainchild of Vickers chief engineer Neville Shute, Panjandrum's core was a 1-ton explosive charge flanked by 2 3-meter wheels. Each wheel was turned by 18 cordite rockets, propelling the device up to 100 kilometers per hour. When launched from a landing craft, Panjandrum would roll right up the landing beach and blast a tank-sized hole in the 3-meter high, 2-meter thick Atlantic Wall. What could possibly go wrong? Shute ran his first test in September 1943 at a popular beach in Devon. Panjandrum roared out of the landing craft and up the beach, then ran wildly off course after several rockets failed. There was only one solution: more power. For his next test, the supremely confident Shute invited a gaggle of top military officials to watch. He'd upped the number of rockets from 18 to 70 and added some cables for rudimentary steering. But when he lit the fuse, all hell broke loose.
Undulations on the beach rocked the Penandrum from side to side, detaching some of the rockets. Every rocket that came loose further destabilized the explosive-laden cart, and it careened toward the officers. They dived head first into the sand to avoid the rockets whipping around the beach like angry wasps. When Penandrum finally came to a stop, it exploded, showering the observers in shrapnel and sand. The project was soon abandoned over safety concern. Years before dreaming up Penandrum, Shute worked at Vickers alongside another legend of British innovation, Barnes Wallis, who, among other things, designed the largest bomber of the war. In the years before World War II, British tacticians had been obsessed with the idea that the bomber will always get through. They had seen the devastation a few well-placed bombs could wreak in World War I, and when they envisioned the next war, they saw this magnified on an unprecedented scale. They imagined whole cities leveled in a single night, and the best defense is always a good offense. Wallis championed the idea of the earthquake bomb, an explosive so powerful it caused a localized earthquake when detonated, collapsing buildings. Such a weapon was so heavy that no contemporary aircraft could carry it, so Wallis designed his own aircraft, the Victory Bomber. This monster plane had 6 V-12 engines and could cruise at 45,000 feet. It had virtually no defenses and carried just one weapon, a single 22,000-pound, 10-ton earthquake bomb. From an airfield in London, the Victory Bomber could take off and bomb Moscow and then fly back, all in one trip. With just one squadron, Wallis promised he could annihilate German heavy industry in a matter of weeks. This he proposed in 1940, well before the wide-scale introduction of 4-engine bombers to the Royal Air Force. While it might not have been visionary, the Victory Bomber was just too costly for a resource-strapped country. Another of Wallis's inventions was adopted, however, and it took center stage in one of the most innovative operations of the Second World War. Wallis also designed the famous bouncing bomb used by 617th Squadron to break the Mona and Ada dams in the Ruhr Valley. The raid was codenamed Operation Chastise, but it's commonly known as the Dam Busters Raid. Wallis had worked on the idea of a bouncing bomb since 1940. It started out as a way of getting a depth charge like the ones used by most air forces and navies to land right next to its intended target. When the depth charge exploded, the water conveyed a powerful pressure wave capable of destroying heavily armored targets. The problem was that these targets, often moored battleships or hydroelectric dams, were always well protected. That's where the bouncing bomb came in. You can skip a bomb on water just the same as you can skip a rock. You just need the right speed, spin, and angle. Wallis and his fellow designers worked out that their bomb had to be released at exactly 60 feet above the water and at a speed of 240 miles per hour. When it hit the water, it had to be spinning at precisely 500 revolutions per minute. Everything had to be exact or the bomb wouldn't explode close enough to the dam wall. Too much spin or too high a speed and the bomb might bounce right over it. On the night of May 1943, the 24-year-old Wing Commander Guy Gibson led his squadron of 19 Lancaster bombs in the first bouncing bomb attack. The Dam Busters, as the men were called, succeeded in blowing holes in both the Mona and Ada dams, causing a torrential flood and temporarily shutting down the industrial output in the valleys beyond. The mission was a success, but they paid a heavy price. 40% of the men who left on that fateful mission never made it back home. Sometimes, a product made for one purpose can be far more useful at something else. This was certainly the case for the last of these crazy British inventions, the exploding rat. Winston Churchill was a keen supporter of clandestine warfare. The idea of causing havoc in occupied Europe with small-scale sabotage operations absolutely delighted him. It's no surprise then that, quite frankly, ridiculous plans for sabotage operations became the standard for Special Operations Executive, or SOE. One of their more harebrained schemes involved 100 dead rats. After acquiring them by posing as anatomy students, SOE agents disemboweled the rats and filled them with plastic explosive. The plan was to airdrop them to operatives in Europe, who would then leave the rats in coal piles around factories and military installations. When workers heaping coal into boils discovered a dead rat, they'd throw it into the firebox and cause a boiler explosion. At least, that was the theory. In practice, the rats had another, unforeseen use. As stated in an SOE report, this device caused considerable trouble to the enemy, but not quite in the way that it was intended. The exploding rats were intercepted and they caused panic among Axis officers. How long had the British been sneaking in exploding rats? How many were there? Could every dead rat be carrying a bomb? Gestapo agents scrambled to find out, and in the meantime, SOE reported the trouble caused to them was a much greater success to us than if the rats had actually been used. Do you think exploding rats would have caused any serious damage though? How do you think things might have changed if the Brits had a squadron of victory bombers? Was the Panjandrum always doomed to fail, or could it have been a clever diversion? It's well known that throughout the Second World War, the Germans were building a plethora of weird weapons they hoped might turn the tide. Not to be outdone by a man with a smaller mustache, Stalin went all in on crazy weapon designs too. Reflecting his focus on land and air warfare, the big man in Moscow greenlit a whole host of experimental weapons projects. In this video, we shed light on just 8 of Stalin's mad projects, saving the craziest for last. First World War, all the European armies had realized that tanks would be critical in the inevitable round 2. But how do you make your tanks better than everyone else's? The Russians threw their best German scientists at the problem and came up with the monstrous T-35. What made this tank superior? It had 5 turrets. It was also enormous, weighing 54 tons when loaded for battle. Obscenely expensive, the Soviets were forced to stop production in 1939 after they'd made 61 of these monsters. Gigantic, slow, and prone to breaking down, the T-35 had a terrible combat record. Some were thrown into chaotic defensive battles during the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa. This wasn't to halt the German advance, but to get rid of a vehicle most officers consider a total liability. The 1930s were the golden age of crazy Soviet weapons, and a major reason for this was resources. The rapidly industrializing Soviet Union was keen to manufacture everything using its nationally available materials. This worked great until Konstantin Kalinin of the Kharkiv Aviation Bureau asked for metal to build his massive experimental plane. The government gave him steel. Steel is pretty strong but also very heavy, so when Kalinin built his plane, the K-7, he had to add extra engines to get it off the ground. That meant increasing the wingspan to maximize lift too, and the project grew out of hand. The final prototype was 53 meters from wingtip to wingtip and weighed a whopping 38 tons. The behemoth needed 8 engines to get off the ground, but could deliver 112 paratroopers or drop 19 tons of bombs. During the K-7's initial set of test flights, the crew discovered the engines vibrated so much that they damaged the airframe. The engineers tried to fix this by shortening the tail booms, but this made the monster plane so unstable that it crashed on its next test flight, killing everyone on board. The project was scrapped. For most people, tanks and planes are 2 very different types of vehicles that don't share many design features, but the Soviets thought a little differently. Oleg Antonov, the famous aircraft designer, looked at a tank and decided he would make it fly. The idea was simple. Wings and a tail would be attached to a T-60 light tank, allowing it to glide. Then, this tank glider would be towed to its target by a TB-3 heavy bomber. When the tank crew were overhead their destination, they would glide the tank gently down to earth where they could support paratroopers right away. Antonov called it the A-40. While it seems crazy to us, for the Russians, airdropping tanks wasn't out of the question. The TB-3 bomber had successfully airdropped T-27 tankettes from a few meters above the ground during the 1940 Bessarabia campaign. If they were left in neutral, the T-27s could roll to a stop when they hit the ground. The problem was that the crews were dropped separately and often lost their tanks. Amazingly, the A-40 actually worked during its only test flight. After detaching from the bomber, the pilot landed safely, detached the wings, and drove the tank back to base. The bomber pilot, however, was not happy. He almost crashed trying to drag the immensely heavy vehicle into the air. Soviet heavy bombers were in short supply and more valuable than experimental flying tanks, so the project was shelved. The Soviet Union of the 1930s had some weapons projects that weren't necessarily crazy, just way ahead of their time. One of them was a naval hovercraft built by Vladimir Levkov. Using air cushion technology, Levkov wanted to build an exceptionally speedy attack craft for the Red Navy. In 1932, he built a 2.5 meter model and tested it successfully. This caught the eye of Stalin's Navy mates, and they had Levkov transferred to the Moscow Aviation Institute. With access to the institute's resources, Levkov quickly scaled up his plans and completed the first prototype hovercraft in 1935. It was named the L1 and could reach speeds of 60 knots on a calm sea. 2 years later, he built the upgraded L5. This prototype really impressed the admirals. It had a cabin for the pilot and a mechanic, a machine gun turret, a troop compartment, torpedoes, and depth charges. It was fast too, with a top speed of 70 knots. The L5's only drawback was its engines. They often stalled if water got into the intake, which happened in even marginally rough seas. Levkov spent a few years working on a better design, but it was too late. The German invasion forced him to relocate to Siberia, and Stalin demanded he worked on a new project, troop transport gliders. Despite its early success, the project was over and the hovercrafts were scrapped. This next vehicle is a classic example of a Russian solution to a Russian problem. I imagine the development went like this. Comrade Igor, how to move soldier quickly in deep snow in middle of glorious Soviet winter. Ah, Comrade Ivan, it is simple. We make sled from old car and old plane. But what if we must kill fascists too? We attach machine gun. The resulting vehicle was named the Aerosan and was extremely successful. There were many iterations, but the basic design was a two-man cockpit with a gunner up front and the pilot behind, sitting on 4 skis and powered by an aircraft or car engine spinning a propeller. The Aerosan was set low to the ground, giving it exceptional maneuverability on ice and snow. In snowy conditions that stopped trucks and tanks, the Aerosan could zip around easily, carrying out reconnaissance, transmitting messages, and raiding enemy supply lines. One of the most successful Aerosani was the RF-8, which was used against the Finns during the Winter War and the Germans during the freezing winters on the Eastern Front. Before the adoption of the aforementioned T-38 heavy tank, the Soviets experimented with plans for an even bigger monster, the T-42 super heavy tank. Like the T-35, this behemoth had 5 separate turrets, one armed with a 107mm howitzer, 2 with 45mm anti-tank guns, and 2 with 7.62mm machine guns. It needed a crew of 14 to 15 to operate and would have weighed over 100 tons. The design team quickly ran into a problem. Even with their German engineering expertise, they couldn't develop an engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. It was 1932 and an engine capable of powering their monster tank was still 6 years away from being invented. To remedy this, the design team decided just to use 2 1,000 horsepower engines. This made the already massive tank even bigger. The final T-42 was such a huge target for bombing planes that it needed to keep 2 machine gun turrets reserved as anti-aircraft guns, something no other tank needed. The design eventually got so massive that the Soviets canned the project. The T-42 never left the drawing board. What's the best way to increase the range of your aircraft? The Germans thought better engines, the Brits thought better fuel, and the Americans thought more planes. But the Soviets had a different idea, bolting several planes together. Called the Tsveno project, Soviet designers wanted their heavy bombers to be able to carry several fighter planes and deploy them from the air. The idea was that fighters could be deployed at further ranges, escort the bombers, and carry heavier payloads. Early designs had fighter planes fixed to the top of the bombers, but tests proved that getting them up there was very difficult, so they bolted them under the wings instead. Shockingly, the crazy idea worked pretty well. Testing showed that the Sveno SPB was the most practical. A TB3 heavy bomber would take off with two stumpy Polikarpov I-16s under the wings. The I-16s would detach and then dive bomb their target, returning to base under their own power. In July 1940, Sveno SPBs of the Black Sea Fleet Air Force bombed an oil depot in occupied Romania. The raid was successful, and between July and August, 30 Sveno SPB raids were carried out on Romanian infrastructure. But as more Bf-109s appeared in the Soviet skies, the TB3 motherships became just too vulnerable. The Sveno project was shelved by January 1942. If you thought a flying tank was absurd, you'll love this. Possibly the craziest two vehicles the Soviets, or anyone, ever tried to combine was Ushakov's flying submarine. The inventor, Boris Ushakov, started designing a seaplane and then adding modifications to allow it to submerge. The final design had 3 engines as well as a propeller at the rear. Steel plates kept the engine sealed, while compartments inside the craft were flooded. One of these compartments was the cockpit, so the crew would have to climb into another compartment to pilot the subplane while underwater. The rationale was that the crazy contraption would search for enemy shipping from air, then once it had located a target, fly ahead, land and submerge until the ship steamed into torpedo range. To facilitate this, the subplane would have to fly around with the periscope, batteries and torpedoes. The Soviet admirals humoured Ushakov for a time, but they never gave him enough resources to make his invention work. Cool as it may have been to fly around in a submarine, the design just never got off the ground. As the Allies tightened their noose around the neck of the Third Reich, the Nazis cranked up their war machine to 11. Hitler and his cronies pulled out all the stops and threw all of Germany's resources into emergency projects and inventions. In this video, we check out the last-ditch Nazi war efforts that came too late to save them. First up, we have the Volkssturm, an emergency reserve formation of fighters pulled from the civilian population. The Nazi Party had enforced conscription since before the war, but by October 1944, all fit men aged from 18 to 45, not in protected occupations, had already been conscripted. To bolster the army in preparation for the oncoming Soviet tsunami, conscription was expanded to include men from 16 to 60, and those who had previously been designated as medically unfit. Hitler's goal was to get the Volkssturm to 6 million members and replace training, equipment and experience with pure fanaticism. The Volkssturm never reached 6 million members and its supply situation was dire. Most units didn't have uniforms and some weren't even armed. Despite this, the Nazi elite made the Volkssturm out to be a heroic partisan organization of German patriots. The old men of the Volkssturm found this hilarious, saying, "Why is the Volkssturm Germany's most precious resource? Because its members have silver in their hair, gold in their mouths, and lead in their bones." Some Volkssturm units were made up of mostly Great War veterans and fought well. The vast majority, however, were more of a liability than a capability. Even Hitler wasn't impressed, saying, "Volkssturm emergency and reserve units have been little fighting value when left to themselves and can be quickly destroyed." By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had completely turned against Germany. Devastatingly high U-boat losses meant that stockpiles of torpedoes were going unused, but the Kriegsmarine had a solution. They bolted 2 G7E torpedoes together and replaced the warhead of the uppermost one with a hollow space for a pilot. Now they had a torpedo driven by another torpedo piloted by a man. It was called the Neringa and was supposed to be a multi-use weapon, only needing to have a new bottom torpedo fitted before being sent out again. The problem was that 80% of the time, the torpedo didn't detach completely, dragging the whole craft and pilot along until it exploded. Hopped up on DIX, tablets chock full of painkillers and stimulants, the pilot could at least go out on a high. Shockingly, the first time they were deployed was a fiasco. 30 were sent to attack Allied ships in the Italian port of Anzio on the night of April 20th, 1944. 13 capsized as soon as they were put in water, and 3 more simply disappeared once they had been launched. The remaining 14 carried out the attack but didn't inflict any damage. This suicidal watercraft was also used against Allied ships in Normandy and a few other scattered attacks around the French and Belgian coast. These attacks managed to sink a cruiser, a destroyer, and 3 minesweepers. Nearly all the Nagers had been lost too, and the Kriegsmarine overhauled the design, deciding they were more trouble than they were worth. The Third Reich was constantly pounded from the air in its last year of existence. Hitler blamed the Luftwaffe and ordered Göring to sort it out. He started the Emergency Fighter Program, an initiative designed to develop a new kind of fighter. The Luftwaffe had noticed the jet-powered Me-262 outperformed Allied aircraft, but was very difficult to maintain, especially with supply shortages. Göring needed a fighter with the performance of an Me-262, the armament of a Spitfire, and the controls of a glider, as that was the only way of training new pilots. He also needed a plane that could be mass-produced and was disposable when it stopped working. Göring was a large man who was probably used to having his cake and eating it too, but his designers just didn't have the supplies to fit the emergency fighter program specifications. The best they could do was the Heinkel HE-162. The HE-162 was a jet-powered fighter first deployed in February 1945. It had numerous problems from rapid production, but handled well and could reach speeds over 750 km per hour. 120 HE-162s were delivered to squadrons, and several of these managed to shoot down Allied fighters. The novel design might have made it more of an impact on the air war, but it came too late. Only 5 months after the HE-162's first deployment, the war in Europe was over. With German war industry collapsing in the last year of the Third Reich, it's a wonder that any weapons found their way into the hands of the Volkssturm. Far from the beautifully machined Karabiner 98 or the battle-tested MP40 was the rush job Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr. When the Volkssturm was formed in October 1944, it was immediately clear they had a critical weapons shortage. German factories simply couldn't pump out complex and well-designed infantry weapons quick enough. To solve this, Nazi High Command initiated the Primitive Weapons Program. Their goal was design a rifle that could be mass-produced with the bare minimum of machine work, ideally with stamped parts. Several bolt-action designs were tried out, known as the VG1, VG2 and VG5, but they were pretty unsuccessful. The Gustloff design, however, was different. Its firing mechanism was based on a scaled-up pistol and could fire on full auto. That about sums up its advantages. In terms of disadvantages, the rifle was highly inaccurate because the sights were fixed and non-adjustable. It had no pistol grip and sometimes fell apart due to poor construction. For the unarmed Volkssturm, it was better than nothing, though not by much, and by the end of the war, 10,000 Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr had been made. Even if Germany had managed to produce enough planes to threaten the Allied air domination of Europe, they still had one big problem: airfields. In the last months of the war in Europe, the Allies had bombed nearly all the Luftwaffe's airfields to rubble. While one solution to this was jet-powered planes that could take off from a short landing strip, the more sensible option was, of course, rockets. That's right, the German solution to a lack of runways was to build a manned rocket that took off vertically. Designated the Bachem BA-349 Natter, this cartoonish aircraft packed 24 more rockets in its nose. This armament was meant to act as an explosive shotgun and annihilate Allied bombers. Luckily, the designers had spared a thought for the pilot, who was likely to be a teenage Hitler Youth member with zero flying experience. The Natter was fitted with an autopilot that would guide the rocket toward a bomber group. When it got close, the pilot took manual control and fired the rockets. The Natter would then have seconds of fuel left to get out of fighter escort range before the pilot parachuted back to base. As far as we know, only one manned flight took place. It lasted 55 seconds, and the Natter averaged a speed of over 800 km per hour before violently crashing, killing the pilot. The 22-year-old volunteer Lothar Sieber was the first man to ever take off vertically under pure rocket power. The next man would be Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space.
The Gustav Volkssturmgewehr wasn't the only German emergency infantry weapon that made its way into the Volkssturm units. Neither was it the most unreliable. That dubious honor goes to the MP-3008. The MP-3008, also known as the Volksmaschinenpistole or People's Submachine Gun, was a rip-off of the British Sten submachine gun. Aside from a vertical magazine and extremely poor production quality, the weapon was a Sten. This meant it suffered from the same issues the Sten did. The worst of these was that if it was knocked, dropped, or banged against something, it could go off, and it wouldn't stop firing until the 30-round magazine was emptied. The Germans had a clever fix for this problem. Their MP-3008 was made entirely from stamped recycled material. Quality control was virtually non-existent, so if it accidentally went off, there was a high likelihood that the weapon would jam before too many rounds were wasted. In combat, the combination of crude design and minimal Volkssturm training gave the MP-3008 a bad reputation, but it wasn't necessarily a complete liability. The MP-3008 was manufactured on military industrial assembly lines but was so simple that small workshops could copy it. During the final few months of the war, workshops and factories around Germany made thousands of MP-3008s for the Volkssturm. Many of these bore the mark of their workshops, featuring different stocks, pistol grips, or being fed by captured enemy ammunition. The last German project doesn't fit the same pattern as the others. Far from being a slapdash invention pulled out of the bag months before the war's end, this project had been in the works for years, but only came to fruition at the end of the war. The world's first true submarine, the Elektroboot was a diesel-electric attack submarine designed to operate fully submerged. It had a massive battery bank that gave it days of silent running time, as well as a snorkel to run the engines while submerged. The hull was built for speed and maneuverability underwater, unlike the Kriegsmarine's other U-boats, which were built for surface running. Those of you who saw our video on the war's best submarines will know the Elektroboot wasn't included, and for good reason. It never came close to mass production. The world's first true submarine was such a complex piece of machinery that shipyards struggled to get their work up to scratch. 2 were completed and deployed, however, but neither managed to sink an Allied ship. While the Elektroboot wasn't much use to Germany in the final years of the war, it was a different story for the Allies. Immediately realizing that the Elektroboot was the future of submarine design, they stole as many as they could. Britain, France, the US, and the Soviets all managed to grab an Elektroboot and use them to build a new generation of submarines. These were the submarines that patrolled the next era of warfare, the Cold War. Hell's Wench was hit. Behind the controls, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker knew this, but he knew something else too. His plane led the way to Ploesti refineries, and he'd promised his men he'd bring them to their targets. Another hit, harder this time. The plane was burning. Approaching from the south, Lieutenant Carl Barthel, navigator for the B-24th Liberator Queenie, saw the horror as it played out in the Romanian summer skies. Baker had been burning for about 3 minutes, Barthel said. The right wing began to drop. I don't see how anyone could have been alive in that cockpit, but someone kept her leading the force on between the refinery stacks. Decisions are made quickly out in the field. Chance outcomes, fine margins between life and death. Personal heroism and valor. Selflessness. This is what made the difference at Ploesti on a day that would become known as Black Sunday. The Ruhr Valley, Kassel, Hamburg, Magdeburg. Centers of industry that kept Germany going during the war. Factories in these locations and in many others pumped out the components the Germans needed to run their blitzkrieg. Knocking out this production, taking these facilities offline permanently, became one of the Allies' top priorities. There were other priorities too, like transport networks. The mass mobilization of German troops ahead of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 depended on the rail transport of the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Even more grimly, so did the mass extermination of Jews and other minorities during the Holocaust. Shattering this network was also high on the agenda. None of this is a secret. With the Battle of Britain won, the Allies began to turn the tables on the Luftwaffe, hitting targets across Germany and hitting them hard. RAF estimates suggest Kassel was 69% destroyed by bombing by the war's end.
In Hamburg, 3/4 of the city lay in ruins. At Bochum, on the Ruhr, the figure was 83%. The Dambusters raid, the daylight missions of the 8th Air Force, the stories of sorties over Germany have been passed down from generation to generation. But not all of these raids are so well known. Operations like Tidal Wave and Clarion helped cripple the Axis war effort, stacking the odds overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies. But these stories are all too forgotten, lost in the chaos and confusion that is the Second World War. We want to redress this balance today, so join us as we tell these forgotten tales. Less than 50 kilometers separate the Romanian towns of Ploesti and Târgoviște. This was just a short hop on a lengthy mission from bases in Libya across the Mediterranean to the oil refineries of Ploesti, north of the Romanian capital, Bucharest. But to the B-24 Liberator bombers that swept over the land, the tangle of rivers and valleys blended into a confusing sprawl. The planes stayed low, navigators scanning the ground as it passed beneath them, searching for Ploesti and the turn from here toward Ploesti. In the lead, Colonel Compton of the TGN spots his marker, the road leading south. This is it. He signals to his pilot, the approach. The 25 bombers of the lead formation set their course 127 degrees for the south, ready to engage their targets. Deep into enemy-held territory, there is radio silence. The situation is tense, but something's wrong. The marker Compton spotted was incorrect. They are off course. Norman Appold of the GI Ginny cannot contain himself any longer. "Not here, not here," he shouts across the radio, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. On board Duchess, flight leader Ramsey Potts makes his own voice heard. "Mistake," he yells, "mistake." They're not on the road to Ploesti, but are headed south to Bucharest. But this is no surprise attack. The Axis defenders are well aware of what's going on. The diversion toward Bucharest stuns them, but only for a second. As Operational Command tries desperately to bring the lead B-24s back into line, enemy fighters are in the air and they're ready to engage. The miscalculations split the force, leaving planes and their crews woefully exposed. Brewery Wagon, piloted by John Palm, had not followed the shift to the south. Instead, she carried on toward Ploesti, coming in from the west as intended and preparing to strike. But the city now bristled with guns, and a huge number of these guns were trained right on the Brewery Wagon, alone as she roared overhead. Anti-aircraft fire rocked the aircraft until a direct hit busted her nose wide open, killing both the navigator and the bombardier. Desperate for those lives not to have been lost in vain, Lieutenant Palm battled to hold his course, but his plane bucked and kicked despite his efforts. The blast had almost severed the pilot's leg, and he knew the game was up. Jettisoning the payload west of his target, Palm turned the Brewery Wagon and made a break for it, but a Messerschmitt was hot on his tail. Shattered by anti-aircraft fire and by the Messerschmitt's cannons, the Brewery Wagon began to disintegrate. Palm made one last effort to gain height, giving his surviving men a fighting chance at bailing out, but it was to no avail. Brewery Wagon came down heavily onto the Romanian countryside. Palm would survive. His leg was amputated by Axis doctors following his capture. Brewery Wagon might have missed her target, but she had dropped her payload around Ploesti, and she was not alone. The squeal of the falling ordnance and the roar of detonation, the thick black smoke belching into the autumn sky, the unmistakable evidence of a raid in progress. Returning from the Bucharest road, the crew of the TGN saw this unfold. They were to the south of Ploesti now, and the city and her refineries were opening up to their left. Leading the 93rd Bomb Group, Lieutenant Corporal Addison Baker knew what he had to do. He had to turn his plane, Hell's Wench, and he had to lead the others to their targets. Further back in the formation, Lieutenant Russell Longnecker, pilot of the Thundermug, was awestruck. He maneuvered our group more eloquently than if he had radio contact with each of us, Lieutenant Longnecker said. He turned left 90 degrees. We all turned with him.
Ploesti was off there to the left and we were going straight into it, and we were going fast. The attack was still on. Alongside Baker in the cockpit of Hell's Wench was Major John Gersted. Together, Baker and Gersted sought to lead the first wave to their targets on the east side of the city. It was only then, while crossing the open ground between the formation and the refineries, that Baker and Gersted realized just how well armed the city was. Anti-aircraft guns, disguised as haystacks, roared to life. Axis fighters, prepped and primed as to the importance of the refinery as a target, engaged their assailants. It was a bloodbath. Practically all of the aircraft in the first wave were hit. Hell's Wench took catastrophic damage, and yet Baker and Gersted pressed on. At the briefing, Baker had said, "I'm going to take you to this target if my plane falls apart doing it." Now, those words were coming true. Arriving from the Bucharest road to the south, Lieutenant Colonel George Brown saw this unfold from the cockpit of Queenie at the head of the second wave. He saw Utah Man, the sole survivor of the first wave, drop her payload on the refinery. He saw a flaming Hell's Wench struggling to lead her line, and he saw the desperate crew bailing out at the last moment. When Hell's Wench finally came down, it missed Queenie by only a few feet. Struck by the horror of the situation, Brown understood what must come next. He brought his second wave in on the refineries of Ploesti. At any cost, somehow and by some way, the objectives would be completed. Author and flyer William J. Philly, who was himself captured after his plane was shot down by the Luftwaffe in 1944, was frequently enraged by the public perception of the Ploesti raid. Writing in the late 1990s, Philly described how remarks like, "You guys really screwed up that mission," made his blood boil. These persons make such statements without any knowledge of what took place in those liberated bombers, he said. Historians and the media did not tell mankind that those intrepid American airmen were determined and brave enough to go against an enemy who was well experienced in aerial and ground combat. These men, most in their late teens, did battle with the most formidable and determined enemy. Their efforts to help bring about the end of World War II will forever be remembered in the annals of aviation history. 177 liberated bombers took off from Libya on August 1st, 1943. Only 162 of these reached the target area. 53 of these liberators were brought down over Romania with 530 men on board. Only 130 of these downed airmen lived to tell the tale after lengthy stays in POW camps. In a human sense, the mission was disastrous. So many young American airmen fed into the meat grinder on that August afternoon in 1943. But what about in a military sense? The common perception has always been that tidal wave was a failure, but many, including William J. Philly, didn't see it that way. As Philly himself pointed out, more than 50% of German petroleum supplies were delayed for about 6 months. The German war machine and the armaments miracle of Minister for War Production, Albert Speer, couldn't run on thin air. It needed oil, it needed fuel. For such a huge swath of petroleum production to be knocked out like that, this was bad news for the Germans. We've also got to think about the broader context. What else was going on in August 1943? To the south and west, the Allies now controlled North Africa, and the invasion of Italy was underway. Even with Italian forces on the ground, there was still a heavy reliance on German oil, in particular oil from the Romanian refineries. To the north and east, there was fierce fighting across a massive front as the Soviet troops sought to push back the German invaders. The battles of Belgorod, Kharkov and Smolensk would all take place in August, while Kursk, the largest tank battle in the history of warfare, would last almost the entire month. The Germans always needed oil, but now they needed it more than ever. Such a lengthy delay, at the worst possible time, crippled the Wehrmacht in the east and brought the Axis forces in Italy to the brink of surrender. The sacrifices made by the men of the 8th and 9th Air Force on that day, and the role they played in bringing about the end of the conflict, must be remembered.
More than a year and a half after the enormous losses over Ploesti, a very different operation was unfolding. While the Ploesti refineries had been a concentrated target, Operation Clarion, launched on February 22, 1945, as the war entered its final stages, was a systematic assault on cities across Germany. The objective? To knock out the Germans' transport and communication network, grinding the German resistance to a halt. On the first day of the assault, 1,372 B-17 and B-24 bombers of the 8th Air Force took off from their bases, supported by 677 fighter planes. The Luftwaffe, now a shadow of its former self after heavy losses across Europe, struggled to offer up any meaningful resistance. The greatest opposition came near Bremen, where a little over 25 Focke-Wulf FW-190s and a handful of Messerschmitt Me-109s engaged the bombers. Elsewhere, resistance forces were even weaker. 15 Me-262s near Berlin, 12 around Stendal-Brandenburg, and 6 around Stettin. At Salzwedel, only a single Me-262 offered resistance, while at Helmstedt, only 2 came out to meet the assailants. The fighter escorts held off their attackers, and the bombers came in on their targets low. Fields of flak opened up as the objectives drew near, but the bombers were undaunted. Only one of the bombers was lost on that first day, downed by one of the Me-262 defenders. The Allied assault was crushing. Ansbach received 420 tons of ordnance. Ulm, Wittenberger, Stendal and Uelzen all received well over 200 tons, with Salzwedel and Bamberg hit with 197 and 187 tons each. Bombers dropped more than 100 tons each on Hildesheim, Peine, Ludwigslust, Kleinsen, Nordheim, Lüneburg and Halberstadt. A further 22 cities were hit with between 20 and 100 tons, while Kitzingen, Ocker and Zwickau were also hit. Fighter units strafed targets on the ground, destroying some 44 aircraft and 104 locomotives, along with oil tank cars and rail cars. Down in the southwest, around 800 B-17s and B-24s moved against targets across a vast area. The sorties hit 32 marshalling yards and knocked 110 locomotives, 40 oil tank cars, and 300 rail cars out of action. Meanwhile, 465 bombers of the 9th Air Force were in action up in the northwest, smashing railway infrastructure, including bridges and junctions, with a bombed 850 tons of ordnance. The 9th claimed to have lost 3 bombers and 12 fighters in the assault. The 1st Air Tactical Command sent 171 bombers out against rail targets in this area too, losing 8 of them, but destroying 10 bridges and 38 locomotive units. Bombers from the British Royal Air Force also ran missions, hitting transport and communication links, as well as the Bensol plant at Osterfeld. Military marshalling yards and rail infrastructure were the prime targets on the first day, and the good visibility, combined with the scant resistance, made success almost certain for these raids. Objectives across the target areas were knocked out of action, but there was major damage elsewhere too. In Hildesheim, the marshalling yard objective was damaged heavily, but 102 civilian homes were destroyed in the process, and almost 1,000 residences were damaged. The city's historic cathedral and St. Michael's Church both sustained damage too, and the raid cost 250 lives. Despite the civilian casualties, Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, was overjoyed with the mission's first day. As long as the clear weather held out, they would go out again the following day. February 23, 1945, it turned out, was indeed clear, and the planes were ordered out once again. On the second day of Clarion, the planes of the 8th Air Force once again came in hard out of clear skies, dropping a combined 3,316 tons on their targets, from Kreilsheim to Ansbach, Gera, Nordlingen, Jena, and Osnabrück, among many others. There was also no resistance from the Luftwaffe. 2 of the bombers were downed, but their crews were rescued. Accompanying fighter groups tore into airfields at Neuburg and elsewhere, as well as transport infrastructure around Augsburg and Frankfurt. At Neuss, a wing of 24 B-24s hit the marshalling yards, dropping 60 tons. To the west, 2,300 medium bombers, fighter bombers, and fighter escorts from the 9th Air Force hit communication centers. 123 locomotives, 3,027 railcars, 1,317 motor vehicles, 305 armored vehicles, 9 bridges, 20 barges, and a wave of railroad disruption were claimed following the attack. 905 fighters from the 1st Tactical Command also ran sorties in the west, achieving considerable damage, while the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Command was out in support too, with rail bridges and ammo depots on their target list. In the carnage, Essen was hit by 1,170 tons from the RAF's Lancasters, while 580 tons fell on the Benzel plant at Gelsenkirchen. Down in the south, the 15th Air Force attacked 8 targets to cripple transportation across this region of Germany. Air superiority was key to success in World War II. Long-range bombers and aircraft carriers meant almost nowhere was safe. The Japanese were able to hit Hawaii, while the Allies successfully ran an island-hopping campaign across the largest ocean on the planet. The ability to fly a long way, hit your targets, and potentially come back unscathed was a big deal. And for a while, it was touch and go. Anyone living in London in 1940, or in one of Nazi Germany's other target cities, would have had a pretty clear idea of who was winning the struggle for the skies. But after the RAF's victory at the Battle of Britain, and the arrival of the Americans with their flying fortresses and super fortresses, the balance of power began to shift. By 1945, Germany was getting pulverized by Allied air power, and she was struggling to keep her head above water. James H. Doolittle was no stranger to long-distance raids. The mastermind of the famous Doolittle raid, the lieutenant colonel had hit targets on the Japanese home islands as early as April 1942, and was promoted to lieutenant general and commander of the 8th Air Force later in the war. Doolittle was impressed by the victories scored on February 22nd and 23rd, 1945. Along with Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder and Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz, Doolittle hailed the excellent results of Operation Clarion. The huge amount of damage inflicted in 2 short days of bombing speaks for itself. Germany, now fighting a desperate battle for survival on 2 fronts, could not afford to have her transport and communication networks battered like this. Clarion was perhaps not the final nail in the coffin, but it certainly helped dig the grave. Not everyone agreed though. The Joint Intelligence Committee was less than impressed with the outcome of the operation, reporting to Air Marshal Charles Portal, the RAF's Chief of Staff, that Clarion had no significant effect on German resistance. Portal said that no further bombing raids of this type should be carried out. Right or wrong, this would turn out to be the case. Once the final bombers returned to their bases on February 23rd, Operation Clarion was terminated. It would be the last operation of this kind. But is this fair? The Battle of the Bulge, the last major stand for the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, was over, and the Siegfried Line was breached. Meaningful German resistance on her western borders was now impossible, and the Soviets had brought their own offensive forwards after the Allied success in the Ardennes. But Germany was still standing. The last bastions of her resistance had not yet fallen. Allied forces in the west still had to cross the Rhine. Operation Clarion laid the groundwork for Operation Grenade and paved the way for success in Operation Veritable. Significant Allied advances in the Rhineland. Allied forces crossed the Rohr and shattered the German divisions on the west bank of the Rhine. The following month, Allied forces would cross the Rhine. The race to Berlin would be won by the Soviets, but the western pincer of the Allied advance would be critical in squeezing the last drops of life out of the Axis in Europe. Could this have been achieved without Operation Clarion? Possibly. Germany was on the back foot after her defeat at the Bulge, and overwhelming advances on both fronts were gnawing away at her resolve and her resources. Did Operation Clarion make a difference? Undoubtedly. Nazi Germany could not repair her transportation and communication networks, and logistics became impossible. Deployed troops stayed in their lines without hope of resupply or rotation, and panic began to set in. Staunch resistance came from die-hard Nazis, proud German nationalists, and well-drilled professional soldiers alike, but without rail infrastructure to back them up, and without a communication network to orchestrate them, their efforts amounted to nothing more than a series of valiant last stands. Germany survived another spring, but she would not see the summer. By May, the war in Europe was over. Operation Clarion played a huge part in accelerating this rapid decline. From Brest to Berlin, from Cologne to Casablanca, and from Tallinn to Tokyo, Allied bombing raids were instrumental in winning the war. Countless airmen lost their lives in thousands of raids across all theaters, and vast amounts of expensive hardware ended up destroyed, transformed into burning carcasses that littered the landscape. There were also enormous civilian casualties. The suffering at Dresden, Leipzig, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki are well known, but they only scratch the surface. While some raids have become the stuff of legend, others have almost been forgotten. Operation Tidal Wave and the enormous toll paid by the pilots and bomber crew on that day in 1943 is one of those missions that has been unfairly sidelined in the story of the war. Operation Clarion, with its destruction of infrastructure on an enormous scale, is another. Both of these raids were instrumental in shattering German resistance at pivotal moments in the war. Without these raids, resistance may have dragged on through the summer or even beyond, with thousands more lives lost. When the story of World War II is written, we can't forget what went on during these raids and the debt we owe to the crews who ran them. But what do you think? How important were Tidal Wave and Clarion to the war effort? What other forgotten raids and missions should we cover? Switzerland didn't have the luxury of distance during the Second World War. It was right in the thick of things, virtually encircled by the Axis powers after the fall of France. Given its geographical position and reliance on other nations for trade, it's pretty impressive that Switzerland maintained armed neutrality throughout the conflict, despite some controversial dealings with the Germans. In this video, we delve into World War II Switzerland, focusing on the climate inside this landlocked nation. With the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s, the Swiss were apprehensive. Nazi doctrine and propaganda pushed for the unification of all German people, including the many Germans in Switzerland, whereas Switzerland was a multicultural nation with its own distinct identity. Of all the potential threats the nation faced, the Nazi threat stood most at odds with Swiss liberty and democracy. The Swiss' will to defend Switzerland's independence was defined by the term spiritual national defense. While a Swiss Nazi party known as the National Movement of Switzerland existed, and while not everyone was on board with spiritual national defense, the majority of Switzerland held anti-Nazi sentiment. The following is from a German intelligence report from November 1939. 90% of the population has a negative attitude toward Germany. 5% are indifferent, and at best, 5% have a positive attitude. Reich German citizens are reportedly called bad names such as Nazi dog. German propaganda is showing little effect. France and England are said to be appreciated because the Swiss reportedly assume that Switzerland will retain its current size if the Western forces win, while they fear that the German-speaking part of Switzerland will be annexed by Germany if Germany wins. The media in Switzerland remained mostly free, with moderate censorship of things like the Sieg Heil salute. Largely, the media was critical of Hitler and the Nazis, with some sources outright mocking them, such as the musical performances of Cabaret Cornichon. Their performances included anti-German satires which became so popular that the Swiss authorities thought it would provoke a violent German reprisal. On the other side of the coin, German propaganda depicted an insurmountable German military equipped with massive bombers, tanks, and submarines against which the Swiss could not hope to prevail. Even if this were true, the Swiss still mobilized in anticipation of a German invasion. In 1939, prior to the fall of France, a man named Henri Guesson was put in command of the Swiss military. Guesson believed that Switzerland's greatest threat was Germany and constructed his plan of defense around this. In short, Switzerland and France would link their defensive lines and work as one to stave off the Germans. By the 3rd of September, Guesson had mobilized 430,000 combat troops and an additional 210,000 support personnel, the latter including 10,000 to 12,000 women. At its height, some 850,000 Swiss were mobilized for war. This was an impressive number considering that Switzerland's population sat at a little over 4.2 million during the war. Of course,
Things changed after France raised a white flag in June 1940. With the German occupation of France, Switzerland was now encircled by the Axis. Goussain's strategy changed. Rather than trying to halt the Germans at a defensive line, the Swiss opted for a strategy of attrition. They would resist the invaders for as long as possible, no matter the cost, and wait for the Allies to win the war. As part of this strategy, known as the National Redoubt or Redout, Swiss forces would retreat to the fortifications they had established in the mountainous central region of the country, where their knowledge of the terrain and home-ground morale advantage would prove an especially tough cookie to crack. On top of buying themselves time, this made an invasion of Switzerland even less appealing. The cost to German manpower would simply be too high. In the words of the Swiss parliament, the Swiss people were, without regard to tongue, confession, or party, prepared to defend the inviolability of their territory against any aggressor to the last drop of their blood. This was reflected on an individual level too. According to one Max Salm, born in 1922, in 1942, young and old civilians were encouraged to join the Ortswehr. Participating in pre-military shooting courses since they were 15, Salm's entire college class signed up. Our instructions were that we should always be alert for parachutists and for people behaving suspiciously, said Salm. We wanted to shoot as many Sauschwaben as possible. Werner P. Auer joined the Swiss army in September 1941 and had the following to say about the situation. At the borders with France and Italy, the Germans had fences with bells. The Swiss would ring the bells as a prank and the Germans would come running. We did not distinguish the Germans and the Nazis. They were the same enemy. I never met anyone who would consider abandoning Switzerland. People would have disappeared into the woods and waged guerrilla warfare. The Redoubt decision was not opposed and did not lead to discouragement. Swiss resolve did not stop Hitler from drawing up plans though. In fact, he was more than a little pissed off. In a meeting with Mussolini, he said the following: Switzerland possesses the most disgusting and miserable people and political system. The Swiss are the mortal enemies of the new Germany. Der Führer also referred to Switzerland as a pimple on the face of Europe and its people as a misbegotten branch of our folk, with our folk meaning the German people. While it never came to pass, Hitler conceived Operation Tannenbaum, a German and Italian invasion of Switzerland straight after he'd taken France. Part of making an invasion of Switzerland as unappealing as possible was maintaining trade with Germany. Encircled and lacking raw materials, Switzerland was also dependent on said trade. According to a report by the Independent Commission of Experts Switzerland Second World War, during the war, Switzerland's imports plummeted from 30% of their net national to 9%, while their exports fell from 25% to 9%. To stay afloat, Switzerland kept open the railway lines connecting Germany and Italy via Switzerland, exported machinery, electricity, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and dairy products, among other things, imported an abundance of raw materials, including 10,267,000 tons of German coal between 1939 and 1945, and purchased massive quantities of gold from both the Germans and the Allies. To put it in perspective, the Reichsbank sold over 1,231 to 1,922 million francs of gold to the Swiss National Bank between 1940 and 1945. A portion of this gold had been taken from victims of the Holocaust, hence the controversiality of the subject. If they hadn't done the above, they likely would have forced Hitler's hand, and the Swiss people may have starved because the country largely depended on imports to feed its population. Rationing was implemented, but the Swiss also came up with what was known as the Wahlen Plan, an initiative to increase the country's agricultural yield. According to Swiss soldier Urs Schwarz, football fields, parks, roadsides, railroad embankments, and the lawn in the smallest garden soon became covered with potato blossoms, bean sticks, and tomato plants, and after working hours would swarm with men, women, and children feeling they were doing patriotic work. By 1943, Switzerland's arable land had doubled in size. While this certainly improved Switzerland's situation, it still needed to import 20% of its food lest its people go hungry. Self-sufficiency was out of the question. As an added pressure, Switzerland interned some 300,000 refugees during the war, including 60,000 civilians fleeing the Nazis, some 27,000 Jews among them.
Considering Switzerland's population size, again around 4.2 million, this was a significant weight to take on, and the Swiss were forced to turn away many refugees, with Professor Jean-Christian Lamberlet estimating the number of people refused to be about 5,000. According to historian Stephen P. Halbrook, toward the end of the war, when the horrors of the Holocaust were laid bare, the Swiss granted Jewish refugees automatic entry into Switzerland and, quote, did their best to rescue foreign Jews. As we mentioned earlier, not everyone in Switzerland held anti-Nazi sentiment. According to an article by swissinfo.ch, the History and Folklore Museum in St. Gallen, Switzerland had an exhibition in 2009 that presented information on some 2,000 Swiss who volunteered to fight alongside the Nazis. Many of these people had dual nationality. Some enlisted in the Wehrmacht, while others joined the SS units such as the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord. Among the volunteers was a man named Robert Prinzing, who ended up imprisoned in the Soviet Union between 1944 and 1948. When he was returned to Switzerland in the 1950s, the Swiss government didn't punish him because he'd already spent so much time behind bars. We haven't covered German and Allied violations of Swiss airspace, downed airmen interned in Switzerland, and the Allied bombing of Schaffhausen in this video, but we may do so in another. When studying war history, we tend to focus on the bad things, the drama. While there was a whole lot of suffering and death, it wasn't all bad. Many people still found time for a bit of leisure and a laugh. Looking at POW camps, for instance, there were some pretty atrocious ones, but not every POW camp was hell. Some of them were actually a good time. Some POWs didn't want to leave the countries they were held in. In this video, we're going to keep on the sunny side and explore some of World War II's best POW camps, keeping our focus on the camps in the Allied nations. Canada took on mostly German POWs during the Second World War. The numbers vary, but these men occupied 25 or 26 camps throughout the country, with the camps at Lethbridge and Medicine Hat in Alberta holding up to 12,500 POWs each, accounting for the majority of the 35,000 POWs in Canada. At these camps, the POWs were protected under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Provided good food and shelter, the conditions were often a lot better than they would have been back on the front lines. The POWs had a relative amount of freedom too, pretty much running the camps themselves under the supervision of the Veterans Guards of Canada. The more trustworthy POWs were allowed to leave the camps to work on farms. At Lethbridge, there were 350-man dormitories, massive recreational halls, dining halls, educational huts, and workshops. Many POWs went to work on the nearby sugar beet fields, with 2,200 POWs working the fields by 1945. According to one Doran Degenstein, the son of a Veteran Guard member during the war, my father spoke fondly of this time with the POWs. They respected him. He would leave his rifle on the seat of the truck and would often ask a prisoner to move the truck ahead with his loaded rifle still on the seat. Johann Pfeffel, a German soldier, was sent to Lethbridge after getting captured in North Africa. He requested to do farm work, and after the war, after seeing how bad things were in Germany, he came back to Canada and became a citizen. According to his daughter, Gisela Kellner, around 10% of the POWs did this. The POWs at Lethbridge could also participate in sports such as soccer, tennis, and boxing, as well as musical groups. While more than 425,000 POWs, including some 371,000 Germans, 50,000 Italians, and 3,900 Japanese, were held in the United States by May 1945 in just under 700 camps, camp life wasn't all that different to how it was in Canada. Treated according to the Geneva Convention, they were fed and sheltered well and given plenty to do. POWs could apply for paid labor outside of the camp, gain an education, participate in sports, watch movies, and read books, albeit often movies intended to denazify the Germans and awaken them to the war's atrocities. Many were even granted passes to visit nearby towns and hang out with the locals, notably American women. Camp Algona in Iowa housed around 10,000 POWs, mostly German. They were treated well and filled a labor vacuum left by the local men off fighting the war. According to the curator of the Camp Algona POW Museum, Jerry Yoakum,
they realized they had it pretty good. They remembered it as a good, safe place to be. They had good food and a decent place to sleep. And in the words of historian Michael Lewick-Thrams, the locals were frightened that the POWs would escape. Once they realized how much money was going to be generated by Camp Algona, that changed. Millions of dollars were generated in economic activity. The men harvested a lot of crops. They became friends with us, of the United States. Even one of the camp's POWs, Alex Funke, spoke highly of it. We were all positively impressed. Nobody could become bored at the camp. Nebraska's Fort Robinson was also highly regarded. Around 12,000 POWs were held in Nebraska throughout the war, and Fort Robinson was one of the state's main base camps. It was built to house 1,000 POWs, but grew to a capacity of around 3,000. According to POW Hans Vaker, our treatment was excellent. Many POWs complained about being POWs, no girlfriends, no contact with family, but the food was excellent and clothing adequate. After the war was over and after repatriation, Vaker returned to the US and became a doctor. Nearly 400 POW camps were set up throughout Britain to house over 400,000 German, Italian, and Ukrainian POWs during the war. Some POWs were allowed to work as laborers, mostly in agriculture, but after Germany's surrender, all the POWs, except the officers, had to work. Most of the POWs remained POWs for a couple of years after the war. After they were let go, some 25,000 German POWs chose to stay and make lives in Britain. Camp Eden in North Yorkshire is one of the most well-reserved POW camps and a war museum, able to house some 1,200 POWs back in the day. The first 250 Italian POWs transported to the camp built it into a far larger camp comprising 45 huts. The POWs worked on nearby farms and crafted things they were able to sell to the locals. They even participated in dances in the town. According to a BBC News article by Duncan Leatherdale, one of the locals said, "The Italian POWs spent most of their time singing, posing, and trying to catch the eye of any female, while the Germans proved more hard-working and reliable than their Latin counterparts." According to the museum's archivist, Johnny Pye, the POWs became well known and a part of the community and came to be seen as people just like us. They would make toys for the children that they had befriended on local farms, and they would make items to trade as well. While we've covered Trent Park in a previous video, it's worth another mention because it's gold. Located in Cockfosters, London, Trent Park was a country house that housed captured German officers. The POWs were treated to a life of luxury, supplied with good food and better whiskey, and allowed to roam the verdant grounds. The catch? The house was bugged, and MI19 listened in to gather vital intel they might not have gained through more traditional means of interrogation. According to POW Kurt Konker, our involuntary hosts are thoroughly gentlemanlike. The next two POW camps get bad raps because of a couple of unfortunate incidents that occurred at them. But ignoring these incidents, the conditions of the camp were far from atrocious. Around 8,000 people were sent to camps in Australia during the Second World War, with this figure including POWs and civilians sent there from Britain. Over 1,100 Japanese POWs were housed at Camp B of Cowra POW campsite in New South Wales. On the 5th of August 1944, the POWs staged a breakout in which 231 of them were killed, 108 were wounded, and 359 escaped. Of the escapees, many committed suicide or were killed by fellow POWs, and the survivors were all rounded up within a matter of 10 days. You might think they tried to escape because of mistreatment, but this doesn't seem to have been the case. According to the National Archives of Australia, a September 1944 inquiry into the conditions confirmed that the camp was run in accordance with the standards of the Geneva Convention, and that none of the POWs complained about the conditions of the camp prior to the incident. According to the Australian Prime Minister at the time, the attack was characterised by a suicidal disregard for life. It's unclear how many POWs were held by Australia's neighbour, New Zealand, in total, but around 900 Japanese and Koreans were held in Featherston POW camp on the North Island during the war. The US asked New Zealand to set up the camp in September 1942 and take on Japanese and Korean POWs from the Guadalcanal campaign. Of the 900 POWs, 240 were Japanese and the rest were Koreans from forced labor units. On the 25th of February 1943, 240 Japanese POWs refused to work and kicked up a bit of a fuss. In the chaos, a Japanese officer was shot but not killed. The POWs then charged and the camp guards opened fire. 48 POWs died and a further 70 were wounded. Like Cowra, the camp was run in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, which didn't rule out compulsory labor. The POWs lived in huts and were allowed to cultivate their own gardens. They played sports and games, like mahjong, watched movies, and put on traditional Japanese plays. They even carved works of art and used them to trade with the guards. According to historian Richard Bullen, the POWs made their own tools out of bits of wire and nails, and from them they carved objects. A way a lot of these objects came out of the prison is they were made and then exchanged with the camp guards for cigarettes. According to a master's thesis by Meisei University student Yasuhiro Ota, Japanese prisoners of war were interned at Featherston, New Zealand and in Cowra, Australia during the Asia-Pacific War. Because of cultural misunderstandings of military traditions, there were violent incidents between prisoners and guards. They had no objection to the living conditions of the camps. They were just seeing opportunities to die with honor.
War is hell. But what happens to captured soldiers after a battle is sometimes much worse. When they weren't shot immediately as part of take no prisoners policies, the POWs of World War II could be sent to some of the worst places imaginable. In this video, we're going to discuss the absolute worst camps and prisons an unlucky POW could end up in, saving the most horrific for last. Located in what is now picturesque Polish farmland, the Nazi POW camp Stalag 8F, sometimes called Stalag 344, was designated for Polish and Russian POWs. These were two ethnic groups the Nazis considered to be subhuman, and Slavic peoples, in general, were seen as fit only for slave labor by the Nazis. Their treatment as POWs in Stalag 8F reflects this. The POWs waged a constant war of attrition against starvation. This was their biggest killer, as desperately malnourished soldiers were highly prone to disease. The unsanitary and cramped conditions provided a breeding ground for many diseases, the worst being typhus and dysentery. In these conditions, death was everywhere. Of the roughly 200,000 Soviet and Polish POWs who passed through the camp during the war, around 42,000 died. In other words, for every 5 POWs who set foot in the camp, at least one would die. In 1945, when the USSR was taking more ground by the day, the POWs from Stalag 8F began what was later called the Death March. The POWs were forced to walk across Germany, sometimes without shoes and nearly always without food, to escape the tsunami of advancing Soviet troops. Hundreds more died on the Death March, some simply dropping dead where they stood from exhaustion and others freezing to death in their sleep. While less brutal than other camps in this video, the sheer number of deaths at Stalag 8F makes it one of the worst POW camps of the Second World War. Now, we're all aware of Japanese cruelty in World War II, especially toward their prisoners, though one camp was worse than all others. While holding fewer POWs than many other camps, the POW camp Sandakan on the northern edge of Borneo was the site of one of the worst atrocities of the war. In August 1943, between 2,000 and 2,500 British and Australian POWs were detained in Sandakan POW camp and forced to do manual labour. Their job was to turn an impenetrable jungle into an operational military airfield. Conditions were deplorable. Water for the POWs was filthy and often made them sick. The food ration was only a handful of dirty rice per day. Beatings occurred regularly and men died daily. But things only got worse. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had turned in the favour of the Allies, and the Japanese were worried about losing access to Borneo's vital oil fields, deploying hundreds of additional troops to reinforce these positions. For the POWs of Sandakan, this was a nightmare, as their meagre food ration virtually disappeared to feed the incoming soldiers. The Allies successfully bombed the airstrip, rendering it unusable, several months later in January 1945. To prevent them escaping into the arms of the Allies, who were expected to land any day, The Japanese marched the camp's British and Aussie POWs to an inland base in waves, leaving roughly every month. Those who were too sick to walk were left at Sandakan to starve. Along the march, POWs were continuously shot for falling behind. By the time the marches had finished, only 38 POWs of the original 2,500 were still alive. Too weak to work, they were all executed. Sandakan was a death sentence for a POW, and the Australian government still regards it as the worst atrocity ever carried out on Australian soldiers in war. Another Nazi death camp, Stalag 6K or Stalag 326, was similar to the first Stalag of this video, except it managed to be even worse. Housing mostly Poles and Russians, but also Italians and French POWs, Stalag 326 was another camp in the broad network of facilities designed to exterminate so-called subhumans through exhaustive work. Camps like Stalag 326 used slave labor to produce many goods critical for the war effort, like weapons and engine parts. This practice was encouraged by German Reich officials, who naturally took a cut of the sizable profits. The POWs of Stalag 326 were also rented out for farm work in the surrounding area, making fat bank for their captors. Mass conscription of men for the military had caused manpower shortages in the Reich, a shortage that POW slave labor was supposed to remedy. Stalag 326 was liberated in 1945 by an American armored unit. They were shocked with the conditions they found, describing a foul, death-like odor around the camp Russian POWs who were completely demoralized. Out of the roughly 200,000 POWs, primarily Russian, who had passed through the camp, 65,000 perished there. There was nearly nowhere worse to be in World War II than on board a Japanese hellship. Mostly smaller freighters that had been hastily converted for human cargo, the Imperial Japanese Navy shipped tens of thousands of captured Allied POWs and Southeast Asian civilians to Japan, China, and other parts of their empire. These POWs were destined to spend the rest of the war as slave laborers and, sometimes, test subjects for demented medical experiments. Life on board an aptly named hellship was unimaginable. Herded into tiny cargo spaces below deck, POWs were crammed so tightly and with so little ventilation that some died from lack of oxygen. Other common causes of death were dehydration, starvation, and the ever-present disease. Dysentery was extremely common, and men were forced to relieve themselves wherever they could, the deck quickly running slick with infectious excrement. The conditions were so hellish, it wasn't uncommon for POWs to go insane. An environment of oppressive humidity, little oxygen, and no water or food broke many men's minds. Desperate and deranged, some POWs would drink urine or slit their veins to open and drink their own blood, and sometimes the blood of others. To round off an experience which the word hellish doesn't do justice, many of these POWs never reached their destinations. The Japanese Navy refused to mark POW transport ships in accordance with the maritime law, meaning that many were torpedoed by Allied submarines and aircraft hunting for Japanese troop ships. One hell ship, the Suez Maru, carried 548 sick POWs from slave labor camps in Malaysia. She began to sink after being torpedoed by an American submarine. Most of the human cargo drowned in the hold, but 250 POWs managed to escape. They swam to another Japanese ship which, after picking up survivors from the Japanese crew, machine-gunned the water, murdering all 250 POWs. Believe it or not, there was a fate worse than even a Japanese hellship. The only entry for the Allies in this video, we have the Soviet gulags. Whether they were toiling and starving in the jungles of South Asia or the weapons factories of the German Reich, Allied POWs only had to endure captivity for a maximum of 5 years. Axis POWs thrown into the black hole of the Soviet gulags weren't so lucky. Their war may have been over, but their suffering would go on for 11 more years. To rebuild its occupied territories after the war, the USSR needed a resilient and expendable workforce, which they found in the millions of Axis POWs they had captured during the war. Over 10,000 unlucky POWs, who were mostly Germans and Poles, remained in the hellish gulags until 1953. Another 9,200 had to toil in the gulags until 1956, before being returned home. One of the worst of these gulags was Vorkuta. Located in Arctic Siberia, the inmates of Vorkuta Gulag mined for coal. This horrendous work forced POWs and other prisoners deep underground without proper equipment. Starving, weakened, and working in the near total darkness and choking dust of a coal mine meant accidents were frequent. Inadequate food and medicine meant that disease was also rife, and when it compounded with the blistering cold of an Arctic winter, the death rate soared. The end of Stalin's reign of terror in 1953 saw records of the numbers of POWs and deaths in the gulags mysteriously disappear. Likely burned by Soviet officers looking to hide their crimes from the new regime, many of the Vorkuta camp records also conveniently vanished. We don't know for sure how many POWs were murdered in each camp, but we do know that at least 1.1 million Axis POWs went into Soviet captivity and never returned. From being executed in the jungles of Borneo to working 11 years after the war in a Soviet gulag, we've covered just 5 of the most hellish places an unlucky POW could be sent during the war. Though, do you agree with our assessment? Which one of these places do you think is the worst? Can you think of any others? There weren't just POW camps, labor camps, concentration camps, and extermination camps in the Second World War. Some camps were set up as preventative measures, or so they say. Basically, a country would intern civilians who they believed might pose a threat to national security. Often, these were civilians whose heritage corresponded with a nation's wartime enemies. In the US, for instance, they interned civilians of Japanese, German, and Italian descent. While the definitions are a little vague and confusing, we're going to refer to said camps as internment camps. The term concentration camp is also applicable, but people generally associate concentration camps with brutality and a high mortality rate, if not outright genocide. In this video, we're going to cover a number of internment camps of the Second World War, which were all over the world. In the United States, as many as 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, around 11,500 people of German ancestry, and just over 1,880 people of Italian ancestry were sent to internment camps throughout the war. These included residents and civilians born overseas and in the US. American Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt had quite a rigid opinion on the matter of the Japanese, stating, "I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. We must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map." Manzanar Camp in Inyo County, California, housed a little over 11,000 Japanese Americans from March 1942 to November 1945. The internees lived in tar paper barracks with very little privacy and very little protection from the elements. They were constantly covered in dust and had to line up for meals and to use communal toilets and showers. They were enclosed in a perimeter of barbed wire and watchtowers. The children attended a school in the camp, however, and the adults could take up poorly paid camp jobs, such as producing camouflage nets and rubber. Some even raised livestock and cultivated fruits and vegetables. There was also a golf course. Of course, the quality of life varied from camp to camp. The situation in Canada wasn't much different. More than 22,000 Japanese Canadians were relocated and interned during the war, accounting for around 90% of the country's Japanese population. While the Canadian government had some 31,000 Italian Canadians in their sights as potential enemy aliens with fascist connections, only between 600 and 700 were actually sent to internment camps. The largest concentration camp of Italian Canadians were interned at Camp Petawawa Army Base in Ontario, where there were also some German civilians. The camp was composed of 12 barracks, each housing around 60 internees. Watchtowers and 2 barbed wire fences enclosed the camp, and like Manzanar, it functioned as a sort of community with people working various camp jobs. Still, it wasn't easy for the internees and their families. In an interview, Italian-Canadian Chester Capone said that the government took his father away for 2.5 years without telling his family why or when he would be released. His father was also in poor health throughout his internment and could only communicate with the outside world via censored letters. India was still under the British Raj during the Second World War, and Germans, Italians, Austrian, and people of other nationalities who had become British citizens or otherwise travelling through India were interned in the country at a number of camps. One of these camps was the Dederdun Central Internment Camp, where the internees were divided into sections, separating pro-Nazi Germans, anti-Nazi Germans, communist Germans, and Italians from each other. Austrian mountaineer Heinrich Harrer, the bloke who wrote 7 Years in Tibet, actually escaped from the camp alongside a German by the name of Rolf Magener, who described it like this. The British had a camp for internees outside the town, where the jungle met the inhabited world, on a site which had once been a tea plantation and had partly gone back to jungle. There were rows upon rows of reed-thatched huts, with such low eaves that a murky gloom surrounded them. Imperial Japan maintained hundreds of internment camps throughout the war, many on Japanese home islands, but many in other territories they occupied too. A lot of them were mixed camps, housing POWs and civilians. Some were occupied by civilians alone. Batu Lintang camp in Sarawak on the island of Borneo was one of the former. As you might have come to expect of World War II era Japan, the camp was brutal. Malaysian author Wee Kut Jin summed it up well. The trying conditions tested to the limits of the human struggle for survival. Food shortages, diseases and sickness, death, forced labor, harsh treatment and deplorable living quarters were daily occurrences. Generally, the civilian internees were treated slightly better than the POWs. Some chose to cultivate the land and tend to various jobs, including gathering wood, latrine duties and cooking. Some internees were forced to do labor, working in timber yards and constructing roads and runways. Many of the civilians were Dutch and British, including Catholic priests and Catholic nuns. When the Australian 9th Division liberated the camp in September 1945, they freed 396 male civilians and 237 women and children. The Japanese operated a so-called Civilian Assembly Center in Weifang, China too. This was Waishan internment camp used to intern over 2,200 American, Canadian, British, Australian, Dutch, Belgian and Italian civilians living in China, including 300 children. American theologian Langdon Gilkey was an internee at Waishan. In his words, "We suffered no extreme hardships of limb, stomach or spirit. We were secure and comfortable enough to create a small civilization, but our life was sufficiently close to the margin of survival to reveal the vast difficulties of that task." Similarly, the Germans interned Allied civilians in Internierungslagers or Ilags in Germany and some of the countries they occupied. At Ilag 5, Liebenau, a castle in Württemberg, Germany, the Germans exterminated 700 mental hospital patients to make way for 300 British citizens who'd been living in Poland. In the city of Besançon, there was the Ilag Frontstalag 142. As many as 5,000 people, mostly British women and children, were interned here between 1940 and 1941. Hundreds succumbed to sickness, such as food poisoning and frostbite, throughout this time, after which many were released and some were transferred to Frontstalag 121 in Vosges, France. It was much more hospitable at 121 than 142. The internees had access to a theatre and several tennis courts, for example. There were some North American internees there too. Australia maintained several dozen POW and internment camps throughout the war, interning around 7,000 Australians of Japanese, German and Italian descent. This amounted to over 20% of Australia's Italian population and 98% of the Japanese people in Australia, with a total of 1,140 Japanese interned. Australia also took on around 8,000 internees shipped over by its allies. On the 10th of July 1940, 2,542 enemy aliens left England aboard the passenger ship HMT Danera. 2,036 of these people were anti-Nazi German and Italian civilians, and most of them were Jews. After a less than comfortable voyage, the internees arrived in Australia early in September 1940, and the majority of them were transported to an internment camp in Hay, New South Wales, on the 6th. Over the course of their internment, they established what was in essence a township, complete with its own currency. In December 1941, many of them were reclassified as friendly aliens and released. Around 1,000 of the so-called Danera boys volunteered to fight in the Australian Army, and after the war, Around 800 of them chose to build lives in Australia. Among them were scientists, engineers, economists, and artists who brought significant value to Australian culture. But we're interested to know what you think. Did you know so many civilians ended up in internment camps during the Second World War? Can you think of any other nations which set up internment camps? July 1941. In the scorching desert of North Africa, a new division is forming. A division of the British Army, and one that will change the course of warfare forever. This is the Special Air Service, or SAS. In time, these three letters would become a code word for staggering resilience, strategic brilliance, and an almost unmatched level of military excellence. From Sahara to Sierra Leone, and from the South Atlantic to the Prince's Gate Embassy siege in central London, the SAS have become one of the most famous secret units on the planet. But we're not there yet. For now, it's still 1941 and World War II rages on. The SAS have a job to do. Their targets are airfields and supply dumps. Their movements are fast and light, ignoring enemy lines and zones of control, hitting hard wherever they are needed. New ideas of special operations, or spec ops, are forming, bringing with them the ultra-mobile tactics needed to defeat Erwin Rommel and his panzers. You've probably heard all of this before. Anyone who's read up on the North African campaigns, or who has caught any of the BBC drama SAS Rogue Heroes, will be aware of what these guys got up to. The stories of heroism that go above and beyond the above and beyond. Less well known are the other soldiers who were helping to make it all happen, at least in those early days. The units who guided the SAS warriors, supported them, and provided them with the intelligence and understanding they needed to hit the enemy where it mattered. A year before the formation of the SAS in 1941, another British unit was operating beyond advanced lines, gathering intelligence and carrying out daring raids on enemy-held positions. This is the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG. Perhaps lacking some of the fame and glamour of the SAS, the LRDG matched them for bravery and ingenuity at every turn. Affectionately, but unfairly nicknamed the Libyan Desert Taxi Service, the LRDG were so much more than this. Fighting under the unofficial motto, not through strength, through guile, it was this unit that coalesced the idea of what Spec Ops could mean and showed the true potential of asymmetrical combat. This is the story of the LRDG, the unit that paved the way for the elite special forces teams of today. It's the 5th of November 1930 and an extraordinary group of extraordinary men meet in the Greek bar of Wadi Haifa, Sudan, to drink beer and discuss their next venture. Among these extraordinary individuals is a man who perhaps looks like the most ordinary of the bunch, but is in fact the group's leader. Modest and unassuming, this man is Ralph Bagnold, soldier, explorer, and future war hero. Tonight though, war is far from the soldiers' minds. Tonight is the topic of Zerzura, the fabled ancient city that is said to lie beside an oasis somewhere in Libya. These men, Bagnold and his 5 companions, would set out to find this city and map new routes across the Sahara in the process. The Zerzura Club, a loose affiliation of explorers and adventurers, was born. Somewhere in this boozy meeting in a Greek bar in a souk by the shores of Lake Nubia, we find the DNA of what would eventually become the Long Range Desert Group. Bagnold retired from the army in 1935 with a medical condition, but his experiences in the deserts of North Africa would fire his curiosity. Experimenting with wind tunnels and applied mathematics, Bagnold set about researching and writing the physics of blown sand and desert dunes, completing his masterwork of physics in 1939 just as war loomed on the horizon. By the end of 1939, war wasn't looming, it was here. Ralph Bagnold suddenly found himself not quite so retired as he had been. The army needed him, and he was recalled as a signals officer and posted to East Africa before being reassigned to Cairo. Bagnold was back in the Sahara Desert and back in a British Army uniform. The seeds of the LRDG were being sown. Egypt in 1940 was in an unusual position. It was an independent nation and had been since 1922, although British troops still occupied the land. It was also about to be plunged into war, although Egypt would never actually declare war on Italy itself, and would only declare war on Germany in February 1945 when the die was very much already cast for the Axis. The Egyptian government and military viewed the unfolding conflict as a concern for the occupying British, and even when Italy and Germany invaded Egyptian territory, the country remained neutral. For the British forces, however, Egypt was vital. Bagnold, with his unrivaled knowledge of the local desert terrain, was appalled by the vulnerability of Cairo's west and south flanks. If the Axis powers devised a way to fight effectively in the desert, to actively use the desert to their advantage rather than having to work against it, Cairo, Egypt, and Britain's North African war effort was in peril. Rommel and his Africa Corps had still not arrived on the continent, but Italian forces in Libya were a significant threat. Something needed to be done to shore up those defenses. Bagnold had an idea. What if he took the exploratory tactics he'd honed in the late 20s and the early 30s and applied them to full-scale combat? This would mean heavily modified vehicles capable of standing up to the deadly rigors of the desert. This would also mean small teams, self-sufficient for weeks or even months at a time. Ultra-mobile, ultra-long range, ultra-skilled. Skilled, ingenious, fearless personnel. A wholly new type of fighting force. So, Bagnold took his idea to General Sir Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East Land Forces. Bagnold's plan was one of surveillance and of assault. His proposed forces could head out into the desert, off-road, watching the coastal highway across northern Libya and Egypt and understanding enemy troop movements. And the assault component of the operation? Bagnold's men could hit remote depots and airfields south of the coast, getting in and out swiftly but striking with devastating efficacy. How about some piracy on the high desert? Bagnold asked Wavell. Wavell was all for it. By mid-1940, the Long-Range Desert Group was born, and their effect was almost immediate. The LRDG began picking off strategic Axis targets across the region and delivering valuable intelligence back to base in Egypt. In Europe, the Allies had suffered enormous losses, and British forces were evacuated chaotically from the beaches of Dunkirk. In Africa, however, a pivotal campaign was just beginning. The Italian fascist state had set out to create a new Roman Empire, a pan-Mediterranean territory held together by economic power and military might. For its soldiers, though, the experience in Libya and Egypt would have been anything but glorious. Temperatures soared by day and plummeted by night. Sand and dust choked engines and settled into kit bags. Wicked desert storms ripped at exposed skin and eyes, and the unforgiving terrain threatened to swallow entire units. Even worse than this, out there, somewhere, moving through the desert like wraiths, was the Patrulha Fantasma, the Ghost Patrol. Bagnold's units struck terror into the hearts of the Axis troops. But Allied successes in North Africa were dealt a heavy blow in spring 1941 with the arrival of Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps. While much of Rommel's reputation is shrouded in varying degrees of legend and myth, there is certainly some truth tucked away in all of this. Rommel was a highly effective commander, and the Desert Fox, as he would become known, led his troops to victories the Italian forces could only dream of. The successes of the Allies in recent months were reversed, and all that hard-won territory changed hands again. The Italian push eastwards from Libya into Egypt had been halted, and the Axis troops were driven back westwards, but the Afrika Korps put the Axis on the offensive again. Rommel, ignoring orders to hold his line, pushed forwards as Allied troops fell back desperately to Tobruk. The LRDG was now a crucial asset for the Allied forces. Observing troop movements gave the regular army a vital lifeline as they scrambled to defend their positions. Daring raids on supply depots and airfields helped the Allies to gain small, critical advantages in key areas of the North African theatre. The newly formed SAS, adding even more muscle to the British Special Forces covert attacks, helped to keep the fires of hope burning. For Bagnold, however, the war was taking its toll. Few were more experienced than he in dealing with the hardships of the Sahara Desert, but all men have their limits. The brutal conditions, combined with the high stress of war, shattered Bagnold's resolve, and command of the LRDG was switched to Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast in August 1941. By now, the tides of war were turning once again. The Allied defenders at Tobruk refused to give in, and the Axis diverted troops and resources from the campaign's eastern front in an attempt to take the port. The Allies may have stalled the Axis advance into Egypt, but they also failed in their attempts to relieve Tobruk. This meant another change of leadership, this time at the very top of the pile, as General Wavell was relieved from his command of the 8th Army by General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck was desperate to get on the offensive immediately and take advantage of the Axis forces' floundering momentum. A large-scale operation was imminent, but first, the Allies' fledgling Special Forces units would need to lay the foundations. On November 17th, the most audacious Spec Ops raid of the war so far began. 55 soldiers of the L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade, by now also known as the No. 1 Small-Scale Raiding Force, parachuted behind enemy lines, landing at Gazala and Tamimi with orders to knock out the airfields there. There are times in war when, somehow, everything goes your way. Then there are times when nothing goes your way. November 17th was in the second category. Dropping into the jaws of the enemy, L Detachment found themselves contending with stormy conditions and heavy weather. The result was a disaster. Many of the paratroopers were injured upon landing in the horrific conditions, and many others were captured by German defenders in the following hours. The remaining soldiers, battered by enemy fire and by the storm, dug in to await rescue. If not for the LRDG, all of the SAS troopers would have been killed or captured on those Libyan airfields. Coming in fast and light out of the storm, the LRDG units extracted the 21 survivors of the operation and whisked them to safety. Among them, a bitterly disappointed and severely shaken David Sterling, the SAS's usually enthusiastic founding officer. But Prendergast recognized the potential of Sterling and his SAS troopers. He understood that, when working together, the SAS and the LRDG could be a formidable, highly effective fighting force, one that would be instrumental in pressing home the advantage in North Africa. Risk was always going to be a huge factor in any covert operation, but LRDG could work to minimize that risk, transporting SAS units to their targets and extracting them afterwards, moving like desert phantoms, like the ghost patrols that had so terrified the Italians. The LRDG and the SAS were a match made in heaven for the Allies, and a nightmare of hellish proportions for the Axis. 3 weeks later, on December 8th, Captain Charles Gus Holliman and 19 Rhodesian members of the LRDG set out from Jala Oasis on an important mission. They were to take 2 SAS teams an astonishing 350 miles across the desert to the airfields at Tamet and Sirte for a surprise SAS strike. This is what the LRDG was all about. Swift, subtle operations over vast distances. And with the SAS working alongside them, they were hitting harder than ever. On this sortie, one of the parties was unsuccessful, but the other managed to destroy 24 aircraft and take out a number of enemy combatants. This kind of rapid, hard-hitting action became something of a modus operandi for the new partnership. The Spec Ops specialists were back in action again shortly after the Tamet and Sirte raids, as a 5-man squad with Lieutenant Bill Fraser in command blew up 37 aircraft in Agadabia airfield, while the SAS and LRDG were back at Tamet before the end of 1941, knocking out 27 planes ordered as replacements for those destroyed in the earlier raid. The Axis reportedly lost around 8,000 aircraft in almost 3 years of fighting in North Africa, and these raids were undoubtedly valuable in bringing the Axis war machine to its knees. In 1943, as Axis resistance dwindled in North Africa and the Allies set their sights on Europe, the LRDG was sent to Lebanon for mountain warfare training ahead of an assault on Italy. But Italy surrendered before the LRDG could be redeployed, so the next action for the group was at the Battle of Leros in the Greek Dodecanese Islands. The unit would lose its commanding officer, John Richard Easton-Smith, on Leros, killed by sniper fire during a lone reconnaissance mission. Over the next year, the LRDG saw action in German-occupied northern Italy, as well as in modern-day Croatia and elsewhere in the Greek islands. In August and September 1944, long-range units parachuted deeper into Yugoslavia and into Albania, working with local resistance, destroying key targets and shadowing the German retreat. As war in Europe drew to a close, the leadership of the LRDG made one last request. They petitioned the War Office for a transfer to the Pacific to take part in the late-stage operations against the Japanese. This request was turned down, and in 1945, the unit was disbanded. Active for more than 5 years and involved in some of the toughest operations of the war, the LRDG takes its rightful place among the British Army's most legendary fighting forces. For archaeologist Toby Savage, January 11th, 2011 was an emotional day. The previous December, he and his colleagues headed to Libya in the hope of finding the remnants of the Merzouk airfield, the scene of a daring early raid carried out by Pat Clayton and a detachment of the LRDG, along with a Free French unit. Armed with Bill Kennedy Shaw's book on the unit, penned in 1945, and aerial photographs from the 1950s, Savage and his fellow archaeologists were certainly hopeful of success, but they also understood the risk that they would find nothing on their adventure. Leaving the road behind them and heading out across the country, Savage's team might have felt just a little bit of what those gallant men of the LRDG felt, sweeping across the landscape in specialized vehicles on their way to an important objective. Only, the lives of Savage and his men were not at risk. Just like Clayton would have done, Savage soon spied the hangar building. Probably unlike Clayton, Savage's team were helped along the way by a local farmer who was well aware of the site's past. "Ah, the old Italian airfield," he said, and Toby Savage and his party felt the emotions surging through them. Exploring the site, 70 years on, to the very hour from Pat Clayton's raid, the archaeologists felt a profound connection to the heroism and the pioneering spirit of those early Special Forces operations. On that day in 1941, Clayton had found the hangar and he'd found the 3 Italian Ghibli aircraft inside, but he also found Italian resistance, and lots of it. Clayton's squad was pushed back, and the French colonel D'Ornano, along with a member of the LRDG, were killed in the fighting. The remaining members of the force escaped back to the desert. Toby Savage's expeditions in North Africa were cut short by the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 and the civil war that ripped across Libya later that year. But what he found in those few short weeks in the Sahara shows us just what those men of the LRDG faced on a regular basis. It's easy to look back on World War II these days as a series of inevitabilities. Montgomery was always going to get the upper hand. Operation Torch was always going to be a success. The German invasion of the USSR was always going to stall in the savage Russian winter, and the Americans were always going to join the fray in Western Europe. But this wasn't the case. As the LRDG were forming in 1940, Western Europe was crumbling under the irresistible power of the German advance. As the SAS and LRDG planned and executed their joint missions in 1941, the Japanese juggernaut was tearing across the Pacific. The outcome of the conflict truly hung in the balance. For these soldiers, operating out there in grim conditions and dealing with the threat of death on every mission, there would have been the very possibility that they'd never see their homes again, nor their families, nor anything else they held dear. All of this just makes the exploits of the LRDG and their comrades all the more amazing. The SAS may have won international recognition as one of the baddest and best units on the planet, but the LRDG deserve a hell of a lot of credit. For a year or so, as the tables began to turn in North Africa, it was the LRDG and the SAS side by side, hitting the enemy from range, disrupting supply lines, destroying hardware, and then disappearing as quickly as they'd come. A ghost patrol, maybe, but a ghost patrol that really packed a punch. The crowd, the very street itself, sways to and fro on a sea of sheer elation. This vast body of emotion pulls you along like a rip current, depositing you into the embrace of strangers and champagne. Flags swim ahead and newspapers fall like confetti. War over. The war is over. The currents deposit you next into the arms of a mother who just lost both of her sons, then into those of a daughter whose father rots in some far-off land, and you start to realize that not every wave in this sea is made of joy. Indeed, every third face is tight with pain, and the unfillable voids in so many hearts bring throngs of grandmothers, grandfathers, sisters, and brothers to their knees, clutching for something they will never hold again. The sea turns red, and the newspaper confetti turns to ash. The city which stood gleaming all around you falls to ruin, reeking of hot bullets and burning skin, and what was once cheering and singing becomes the wailing cacophony of hell. World War II may be over, but the suffering isn't, and no matter how hard you try, you know things will never go back to how they were. Things can never be the same again. World War II was a scar humanity will wear forever, and the wound continues to sting. Rebuilding things the way they were is impossible, but many of us have lived good lives and experienced joy so much that we forget, from time to time, the scar is even there. But what exactly was there to rebuild? What was broken? Well, the answer is everything. Though in this video, we're going to discuss the chaos left in the wake of the Second World War and provide some examples of what humanity did about it. One immediate impact was human casualties. Some 75 to 85 million people died as a result of the war, and this is about 4% of the population. While many of the bodies were buried, burnt, or otherwise disposed of throughout the war, many continued to rot when it ended, often far from home. Those that could be identified and returned home were, though those that weren't were buried without a name. Regardless, disposing of the dead was an immense chore in itself. As for rebuilding the population, well, there is only one way to do that. But rebuilding families, that could only be done with love and time. Mind you, those figures of 75 to 80 million were just deaths. Think of all those wounded in the war, the amputees, the heat and chemical burn victims. Prosthetics are only so effective as organic limbs, and some burns never fade. Consider also the genetic damage inflicted by chemical and nuclear warfare. The radiation of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings still echoes through the Japanese people. Nor can we forget the mental scars. PTSD plagued many veterans until the day they died, and it was never really cured, only managed. The families of these tormented souls suffered their portion too, bearing the weight through the generations. Casualties include captures too, and there were two sides to this coin in the aftermath of the war. POWs freed and possibly repatriated, and surrendered enemies taken as POWs. Both of these are logistical nightmares, though there was an emotional element to it too. POWs had first to be set free, then processed, and then transported, hopefully home. Often, this was between countries, if not continents. Some POWs never made it home, while it took others years. As for new POWs, they had first to be captured, processed, and interned. Many Germans, for instance, were interned in POW camps in Allied occupation zones in Germany. Others were assigned to forced labor, as many were captured by the Red Army. While many POWs were put in camps and made to work, others were tried, convicted, and executed for war crimes. While there is certainly an argument that many of these criminals deserved death, this was still a costly process, and it certainly took a toll on the people facilitating it. But at the end of the day, some things just can't be rebuilt, only wiped from the face of the earth. As we'll mention when we discuss the ruination of residential property and the expulsion of people from occupied and annexed territories, some 11 million people were made refugees after the war, and this resulted in millions more casualties, often by starvation, disease, and exposure. While some lost their homes or were forced out of them, as we mentioned before, many were former POWs and slave laborers. As for rebuilding, temporary facilities for displaced persons were established throughout Europe, housing some 850,000 people by late 1947, Poles, Greeks, and Russians to name a few. Some overseas nations took refugees too. Australia, for instance, set up things like the Displaced Persons Program, which allowed 170,000 refugees to enter the country between 1947 and 1951. Another immediate was the ruins. Entire cities pulverized into the earth. Atomized cities were, of course, a nightmare to clean, though their resurrections are also the most literal example of rebuilding possible. Truly symbolic. While Hiroshima and Nagasaki take the cake, we can't forget Warsaw, which was torn apart by the Luftwaffe in 1939 and thoroughly finished by the Heer in revenge for the Warsaw Uprising. And nor Berlin, which was pummeled with shellfire right up until the Red Army swept through, nor Dresden, which the Allies turned into a flaming hell on earth. You can walk through any of these cities today. They have been remade, though most left pieces of their pre-resurrection skeletons standing in the sun, testament to all they've endured. Of course, with so many industrial and residential structures destroyed, many were out of jobs and homes. Foreign occupation and territorial changes were a nightmare too. Borders were redrawn and nations both claimed new territories and rescinded old ones. Allied organizations such as the Allied Control Council, which administered control of occupied Germany, were established, though not all occupation was regulated. The Soviet Union, for instance, annexed the countries it invaded on its march west to Berlin, making satellite states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany to name a few. Whereas Japan was forced to return Manchuria to China, and the Philippines, Burma, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and other territories to the Allied nations claiming to own them. Many citizens were forced out of their homes and their countries, becoming refugees. To put it in perspective, some 10 million Germans were expelled from the occupation zones established by the Allied Control Council, and between 1.5 and 2 million of them died in the process. Regaining territory lost in the war may have been part of rebuilding, but the Soviet Union annexing countries created a whole new mess. We brushed over unemployment, but we've barely considered economical impacts. Like we said, industrial infrastructure was hammered throughout the war, with Europe, for instance, losing 70% of its total infrastructure. But not all of it was destroyed in the fighting. Germany, for example, was made to destroy hundreds of its manufacturing plants after it capitulated, rendering it incapable of raising a significant military and putting thousands out of jobs. Continuing with Germany as an example, the reconstruction process was long and arduous, though the dismantling of industry in West Germany, at least, ended in 1950, allowing it some room to breathe. Demilitarization had similar effects, and Allied military occupation in West Germany didn't end until 1955. But it wasn't all destructive. The US, for instance, set up a $12 billion foreign aid initiative called the Marshall Plan in 1948, designed to rebuild Western Europe physically, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, and generally improve prosperity. Oh, and staunch the spread of communism, of course. Though we can't forget war reparations, which took a massive toll on Germany, Japan, and Italy. The defeated powers paid the Allies reparations ranging from hundreds of millions to billions of US dollars, and while this put them under the thumb, it certainly helped the Allies rebuild. But financial hardships weren't limited to defeated nations, and some allied nations, such as Britain, racked up crippling war debts. As for Britain, it owed the US billions of dollars by the end of the war. Fortunately, Britain was able to negotiate the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, which allowed it to stay afloat and pay the debt slowly, right up until 2006. Of course, the whole world was tense after the war, and this resulted in subsequent conflicts. Some not quite the same scale, but just as bloody. For instance, tensions between the capitalist Western Bloc and Communist Eastern Bloc were manifested in the Cold War, and one of the first bloody conflicts of this was the Chinese Civil War. The capitulation of their common enemy, Imperial Japan, saw the Chinese communists and nationalists back at each other's throats, and the Chinese Civil War resumed, with the communists eventually gaining victory. And a desire for decolonization resulted in the First Indochina War and the Malayan Emergency, in which both the former French and British colonies achieved independence. All these conflicts created further chaos, adding to the stack, and how we've been rebuilding after each of them are topics worthy of their own videos. But some tensions don't always manifest in war. Some are held not by political leaders, but the people. The people never forget, and they rarely forgive, and conflicts such as World War II shape our social and cultural climates, inciting distrust and hatred between people of different nations and races. Mending this is part of the long game rebuilding process, and it can't be downplayed. Yes, World War II is a trauma humanity will bear forever, but maybe that's a good thing. We've got to learn from mistakes like this, and as cheesy as it sounds, build a better and brighter future. A lot of bad came out of the war, but some stepped up to the challenge and at least tried to fix things up and make them better. There was some light in all that darkness. But we'd like to know what you think. Do you disagree with anything we said? Can you think of any other broad-scale impacts of the war? And can you think of any other good examples of how humanity tried to rebuild? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and we'll be sure to respond to some of the good ones. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all those juicy links in the description as well. If you're keen to talk to other history buffs and get all the sources for every single video, then do check out our Discord server. And if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching this video, please do check out the Patreon as well. Every dollar helps improve the quality and quantity of videos we produce here on the channel. Anyways guys, as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned something new.